Live now to Capitol Hill, where top Army and Air Force officials are testifying this morning about their budget priorities for 2020. They're taking questions from members of the House Armed Services Committee today. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 3.
Those of you who are here now at the drop of the gavel are in line, basically. Everybody else who comes in goes to the back of that line, and then even if any of the people who are here at the drop of the gavel leave, when they come back, if they are next, it is their turn. So I'll handle that according to the rules and just hope you are all aware of it. Well, welcome. Today we are pleased to have the posture hearing for the Army and the Air Force, and to have with us as witnesses the Honorable Mark Esper, Secretary of the Army, General Mark Milley, Chief of Staff of the Army, the Honorable Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, and General David Goldfein, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. I want to congratulate General Milley on his nomination to be Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Very much enjoyed working with him in his current capacity, and look forward to working with him in that capacity as well. And thanks Secretary Wilson for what will likely be her last hearing before the House Armed Services Committee. Appreciate her service both in Congress and in the military, and wish you very, very well. I don't think you actually left just because of the Space Force, but I'd be sympathetic if you did. So we'll talk about that more later. But thank you all for being here. There are a lot of issues to go over. I will not attempt to cover all of them in my opening statement. Just want to mention a couple. First of all, I know the Army has done a very, very aggressive effort to look at all of their programs and basically modernize what the Army is purchasing and how they are organizing for the future. And it is a rapidly changing environment, both in terms of the threats and in terms of the technology that's going to be necessary to meet those threats. So I look forward to hearing more about the details of how you arrived at the decisions that you did and how you think we can support you in that effort going forward. And yes, with the Air Force, I know you have done a similar effort to try to look at how you can maintain the number of airframes that you need to meet all the needs and requirements that you have. I'm curious, I know the study came back that there was a substantial need for an increase in the number of planes in the Air Force. I'm curious about exactly which planes you think are most important and how that's going to fit into the future budget. And yes, I am interested in getting your specifics on how we handle the Space Force. And this is really a simple, straightforward thing, and I want to compliment Mike Rogers and Jim Cooper, two members who have been working on this issue for a number of years on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. We need to place a greater emphasis on space, without question. Put simply, our goal there is to place a greater emphasis on space without wasting money. Without creating more unnecessary bureaucracy, and to figure out what the best way is to rearrange that within the DoD and within the Air Force's responsibility. So we'll be curious to hear your comments on how we can proceed on that front. And then there are two broader issues that I just want to touch on. Number one is something we've said over and over again in this committee, but the importance of getting an on-time appropriations process so that on October 1, you have your budget, you know how much money you're going to have to spend during the course of that year, cannot be overstated. For FY 2019, it was the first time in a long time where we had that. I know we cut the deal for FY 2018, but we didn't cut that deal until about 6 months into the fiscal year, and that is not the same as having the money at the start. So whatever our differences on what the budget cap should be, we need to resolve them and go forward. I will also say that, you know, whatever led to the budget caps and the Budget Control Act that was passed in 2011, thinking that strict adherence to that law that was passed 8 years ago is in any way going to make us fiscally more responsible, I think is folly. In a $4.75 trillion budget, obsessing over tens of billions of dollars in the discretionary portion of it, be it defense or non-defense, isn't all that helpful from a fiscal responsibility standpoint, and is unbelievably damaging in terms of the ability of the government to function. If you don't know how much money you're going to have from one month to the next, or what programs you can and can't spend it on, it is very difficult to function. And I've worked with the Pentagon over the course of the last 8 years. As you've attempted to function in that environment, it's brutal and difficult, and it is just as brutal and difficult for the non-defense discretionary budget to try and do that as well. And the last issue I will point out is the issue of the audit, the issue of understanding understanding exactly where DoD spends its money. I would recommend to everyone here, if you haven't read it, Rolling Stone did a very interesting article about the challenges that exist within the Department of Defense, figuring out how and where it spends its money. Just simple, basic accounting. And the problem goes back decades. It has been built in the Department of Defense long before any of you in front of us showed up at the Pentagon. And now it has reached the point where there is a certain argument that it is so confusing and so tangled up that there's no way to untangle it. Well, this committee does not accept that. And what I would be curious, how can we begin the process? We are not going to get a full audit next month, next year. It is unbelievably cumbersome. But there has to be, it's like when the cords get all bundled up. There's got to be some place to start, to sort of pull it apart and start working. And that's what I want to see, progress, so that eventually we can get to the point where we can track the money. Because right now in the Department of Defense, you don't even really know how much inventory you have. You have to make it up at a certain point just to put a number out there, but you don't know. Not on the big stuff, you know how many bombers you have, but on all the other things, on the buildings, on the basic pieces of equipment, we just don't know, and we can't account for that in a way that gives us any confidence in the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the budget. So we're going to need to work on that as well. As I said, there are a lot more issues, but that's all I have for now. With that, I turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join in welcoming and thanking our witnesses for being here and for their service. I would particularly say that I'm grateful that Secretary Wilson allowed herself to be persuaded to return to government service, and would point out that as she leaves government service at the end of next month, she is choosing to be a Texan. And all of you could take a hint with that good judgment when it comes time to do something else. I want to commend a couple things at the beginning because in some ways I think they're unusual. Number one, I want to commend what at least has seemed to be, from my vantage point, a close working relationship between the service secretaries and their respective service chiefs, as well as, I think, an unprecedented relationship among the service secretaries. Now, you would think that's the way it always ought to be, and maybe it should, but it's not always the way it's been. I'm sure there are stresses and strains that are not obvious from the outside, but I think that's important, and each of you have participated in that. Secondly, I want to commend the Army for first taking the time to go through each of the programs under your jurisdiction and to make tough decisions. I may or may not agree with all the decisions you make. That's irrelevant. But the point is, y'all have been serious about making the changes internally to ensure that the Army is prepared for the challenges coming at us. That includes reorganization, the creation of Army's Futures Command, and a number of other decisions. I think that's important. And it's something that not only the services, but we need to share as well. I agree completely with comments that the chairman has made about the budget. We have, in my estimation, begun to turn things around when it comes to readiness and modernization and the other things this committee has focused on in the previous few years, but that job is not done, and I know we will talk more about that. I also agree with the chairman that we all, and this has to be a joint effort, the committee and the services need to continue to work to not only track where the money goes, but improve the way that it's spent. And I think the very first step was when this committee put into law several years ago a requirement that the audit take place. We knew it was not going to have a good outcome, but the point is you got to find the problems before you can start to solve them. And I think going through program by program, as y'all have done, that sort of intense scrutiny is good and important. Last point I want to make is a few years ago, President George Bush, in a different context, talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. Well, I think that kind of applies to some of the work we do too. Because sometimes you hear the excuse, well, that program can't be cut, it's just too hard, or that's just how long it takes to get a new program fielded, or Congress will never go for that, or all sorts of excuses. With every briefing and hearing we have about the security environment in which we operate and the adversaries which we face, I have a greater sense of urgency that the Congress and the Pentagon need to make the changes necessary so that the country can be defended today and into the future. And I don't think any of those excuses, are going to cut it when at some point in the future people look back and judge all of our tenure here. So as Chairman said, there's lots of issues to talk about specifically, but I think it's on all of us to push hard and push fast, because that's the way the challenges are coming at us, and they're not going to slow up and wait for us to catch up. I yield back.
Thank you. I heartily agree with the ranking member's statement, and particularly his last point. I think it was incredibly well put, and the most important thing that we need to work on. And with that, Mr. Esper, you will kick us off. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the subcommittee of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I want to first thank Congress for helping us reverse the readiness decline that developed following several years of budget uncertainty. Because of the strong support provided in the FY18 and FY19 budgets, we have increased the number of fully ready brigade combat teams by 55% over the past 2 years. However, while I'm confident we would prevail against any foe today, our adversaries are working hard to contest the outcome of future conflicts. As a result, the Army stands at a strategic inflection point. If we fail to modernize the Army now, we risk losing the first battles of the next war. For the past 17 years, the Army bore the brunt of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. For over a decade, we postponed modernization to procure equipment tailored to counterinsurgency operations. Our legacy combat systems, designed for high-intensity conflict, entered service when I joined the Army in the early 1980s. While they dominated in past conflicts, incremental upgrades for many of them are no longer adequate for the demands of future battlefield, as described in the National Defense Strategy. We must build the next generation of combat systems now, before Russia and China outpace us with their modernization programs. Despite Russia's looming economic difficulties, they are steadily upgrading their military capabilities. In addition to field testing their next-generation T-14 Armata tank, they continue to advance the development of their air defense and artillery systems. And when combined with new technologies such as drones, cyber, and electronic warfare, Russia has proven its battlefield prowess. We have no reason to believe that Moscow's aggressive behavior will cease in the short term. Russia's blatant disregard for their neighbors' sovereignty, as demonstrated in Ukraine and Crimea and Georgia, is a deliberate strategy meant to intimidate weaker states and undermine the NATO alliance. In the long run, China presents an even greater challenge. They continue to focus their military investments in cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence, directed energy, and hypersonics. Beijing's systematic theft of intellectual property is also allowing them to develop capabilities cheaper and faster than ever before. To deter the growing threat posed by great power competitors and to defeat them in battle if necessary, we must leap ahead to the next generation of combat systems, and we must do so now. Over the past year, the Army took a major step forward in reorganizing its entire modernization enterprise with the establishment of Futures Command. In doing so, we stripped away layers of bureaucracy and streamlined our acquisition process while achieving unity of command and greater accountability. Guided by our 6 modernization priorities, Army Futures Command is hard at work developing the systems needed to maintain battlefield overmatch in future conflicts. When we reviewed the budget this time last year, we felt that it was unreasonable to ask Congress for the additional $4 to $5 billion needed annually to fund our modernization, without first looking internally to find the necessary resources. As a result, the Army's senior leaders took an unprecedented initiative to comprehensively review every Army program. Our goal was simple: find those programs that least contribute to the Army's lethality and reallocate those resources into higher priority activities. After over 50 hours of painstaking deliberations, we eliminated, reduced, or delayed nearly 200 programs, freeing up over $30 billion over the next 5 years. We then reinvested this money into our top priorities, those systems and initiatives we need to prevail in future wars. The Army will continue to ruthlessly prioritize our budgets to provide a clear, predictable path forward that will achieve our strategic goals. That process is underway now as we develop next year's budget. Support for the Army's FY20 budget is critical to building the Army the nation needs and demands. Those who are invested in legacy systems will fight to hold on to the past while ignoring the billions of dollars in opportunity created by our investments in new technologies and what it means for the Army's future readiness. While change will be hard for some, we can no longer afford to delay the Army's modernization. We believe we are following the sound guidance conveyed to us by many of you. In this era of great power competition, we cannot risk falling behind. If left unchecked, Russia and China will continue to erode the competitive military advantage we have held for decades. The Army has a clear vision, which I ask be entered into the record, and a sound strategy to maintain battlefield overmatch. We are making the tough choices. We now need the support of Congress to modernize the force, and it starts with the FY20 budget. The bottom line is this: we owe it to our soldiers to provide them the weapons and equipment they need to win decisively in future battles. Thank you again for your continued support. I look forward to your questions and appreciate the opportunity to discuss these important matters with you today.
Sorry. Without objection, the statement that you asked for will be entered into the record. General Milley.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Esper here today. And I would like to also acknowledge the great service in uniform in Congress and as the Secretary of the Air Force with Secretary Wilson. Her performance and her exceptional service is a tremendous inspiration to all of us. It is true that the Air Force got away from us in 1947. We're determined to get them back, but we are, I can say without equivocation, that the United States Air Force is the Army's absolute best friend in the field of battle, and they are always the first one we call. So thank you, Secretary, for your service. It remains an incredible privilege for me to represent the almost 1 million soldiers in the regular Army National Guard, the United States Army Reserve that are arrayed in 18 divisions, 58 brigade combat teams, and deployed to over 180,000 troops today in 140 countries around the world on freedom's frontier. While much of our testimony today and your questions are going to focus on the challenges the Army faces and how to make us stronger and more lethal, and that's appropriate, it's also important to note up front for you, the American people, for this committee, for the entire Congress, our allies, and most importantly, for our adversaries, that the United States Army, as part of the joint force, is a highly capable, globally deployable force today, and we can go anywhere, anytime, and beat anyone on very short notice in the conduct of ground combat. We have the training, the equipment, the people, the leaders to prevail today, and no adversary out there should ever doubt that. I concur with Secretary Esper's comments on the threats posed by China and Russia, and they are, in fact, in my view, rising. The international order and, by extension, United States interests are under increasing and dangerous pressure. China is a significant threat to the United States and our allies in the mid and long terms, and I would categorize them as a revisionist power seeking to diminish U.S. influence in the Pacific and establish themselves as a controlling regional power in the Western Pacific and more broadly in all of Asia, and they are setting conditions to challenge the United States on a global scale no later than mid-century. Russia seeks to return to great power status and will continue to challenge the United States, not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East, Asia, the Arctic, Africa, the West Hemisphere. They continue to undermine NATO as an alliance and sow dissent throughout the European continent, as we know, even in our own homeland, through a variety of means. Russia remains the only current existential threat to the United States and will become, in my opinion, increasingly opportunistic and willing to take greater risk in the near term. So what this budget will do. In the last 17 years, our strategic competitors have eroded our military advantages as outlined by Secretary Esper. With your help, starting 2 years ago, we began to restore our competitive advantage, and our recent budgets have helped improve our readiness and lay the groundwork for future modernization. and we ask with this budget that you sustain those efforts. Our goal remains 66%, two-thirds of the active duty Army brigade combat teams, and 33% of the National Guard and the U.S. Army Reserve units to be on the highest levels of readiness. Those numbers, those levels of readiness, are what we need to be able to align with the strategy that's laid out in the National Defense Strategy, and with continued, consistent, predictable congressional support, on-time budgets, we can reach those levels of readiness sometime in 2022. Specifically, this budget will fund 58 brigade combat teams and 6 security force assistance brigades for the total Army, 32 combat training center rotations to include 4 for the National Guard, increased pre-position stocks in both Europe and Indo-PACOM, and many, many other current readiness initiatives. In terms of modernization, which is really just another term for future readiness, this budget will fund improved capabilities across our 6 modernization priorities, which include 30 specific programs that are embedded within them. In addition, another 50 programs that are of significant importance to the Army. In short, this budget will increase the lethality of munitions and forces across the globe and increase the lethality of the Army in the future against any threat. Lastly, I want to highlight that this committee, that Congress as a whole, has provided us tremendous support over the last several years. We recognize that, and we are committed to applying our resources deliberately and responsibly, understanding that they've been entrusted to us by Congress and the American people. And we will continue to do that going forward to ensure that we maintain our solemn obligation to our soldiers, that we will never send our sons and daughters into harm's way unless they are properly trained, fully manned, and have the best equipment money can buy, and are extraordinarily well led. Thank you again for your continued support to our soldiers and their families, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put my entire statement in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And then just summarize a few things. The budget that the Air Force has presented this year is aligned with the National Defense Strategy. That's the guidance we gave as we began to develop this budget, and we've been consistent about that all the way through. I'd like to really just highlight 3 things with respect to our budget and the state of the Air Force today. Last year, the Congress asked the Chief and I, what is the Air Force you need to implement this National Defense Strategy? And at the time, we didn't know, and we should know. And you directed in the Defense Authorization Act last year that we do a piece of analysis on what is the Air Force we need to implement the National Defense Strategy. Not what is the Air Force we have or what is the Air Force we can afford in this year's budget, but what do we need? The answer to that is that the Air Force will be in the forefront regardless of where the next conflict occurs. And we are too small for what the nation is asking us to do. Today, we have 312 operational squadrons. The Air Force we need has 386 operational squadrons. Putting that in context, at the start of the Gulf War, there were 401 operational squadrons in the United States Air Force. It is not unreasonable, given the threats that we face, that we need to build a larger and more capable Air Force. But it's not just more of the same. We have to evolve to incorporate advanced technology and use it in new ways. Second, America is building a more lethal and ready Air Force. We are more ready today than we were 2 years ago, in large part because of the resources the Congress has made available to the Air Force and our focus on restoring the readiness of the force. That means people and training and equipment and maintenance and spare parts and munitions. What you have allowed us to do is to be more ready for anything the world may throw at us. Third, we're fielding tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter. In 2016 and 2017, the Congress gave us new authorities and pushed more authority down from the Office of the Secretary of Defense level to the services to give us more authority to buy equipment faster and smarter. We are implementing those authorities and stripping time out of program plans to get capability from the lab bench to the warfighter faster. We cannot succeed, Mr. Chairman, without your support. And I wanted to personally thank all of you for the on-time budget that you gave to us in this fiscal year. It gives us stability and the ability to plan and execute that budget. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out the need that we have for a supplemental for this year to cover the costs of the terrible storm that hit Tyndall Air Force Base and more recently Offutt Air Force Base. If we don't work together to find a way through to do a supplemental, it's going to have a devastating impact in the last 6 months of this fiscal year as we try to hold things together in the wake of 2 terrible storms. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. General Goldfein.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, what an honor to once again represent your Air Force, active guard, reserve, and civilian airmen who stand the watch and provide top cover for the nation and our joint and allied teammates, to include the finest and most lethal Army on the planet. And I will just say, hooah. This hearing is among the first official forum since Secretary Wilson announced her pending departure from the Air Force to become a Texan. And I want to say publicly on behalf of all airmen and their families, what an honor it's been to work with her every day to make our Air Force more ready and more lethal. And this budget represents the culmination of our work together to build the Air Force we need to compete, to deter, and if deterrence fails, to fight and win. And so I want to state for the record that we are a better Air Force because of the leadership and the vision of our Secretary, Dr. Heather Wilson. Chairman, I went to war for the first time as a young captain, flying F-16s at a Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina just a few days after Saddam Hussein invaded his neighbor in Kuwait. And as the Secretary said at the time, we had 401 operational squadrons and 945,000 active guard, reserve, and civilian airmen in an Air Force that landed our nation's initial punch. 401 operational squadrons to defeat a middleweight, non-nuclear power who threatened his neighbor in the region, but who posed little threat to our homeland and our way of life. Today, as the Secretary said, we have 312 operational squadrons, down from 401. And we have 685,000 airmen, down from 945,000. We're not the Air Force of Desert Storm. When General Tony McPeak was the chief in 1991, he and his fellow Joint Chiefs were focused on supporting a single combatant commander, General Norm Schwarzkopf, the commander of U.S. Central Command. But today, should deterrence fail and we find ourselves defending our nation against a major nuclear power, as chief, I'll be simultaneously supporting at least 3 combatant commanders who will be demanding air, space, and cyber power. The geographic combatant commander will request forces to support his campaign, which will include backfill for any fighters, tankers, command and control forces he'll place on nuclear alert. The next call I'll receive will be from U.S. Strategic Command, who will tell me how many bombers, tankers, and command and control forces he needs to execute his nuclear mission, protecting not only our homeland, but also our allies and our partners. And the third will be from U.S. Northern Command, who will tell me how many fighters and tankers and ISR and C-2 aircraft he needs to execute his plan to defend the U.S. And the Air Force will support these missions simultaneously, not sequentially, while at the same time, shoulder to shoulder with our joint teammates, maintaining a global presence to deter any rogue nation who might choose to take advantage of our situation, while simultaneously maintaining campaign pressure against violent extremism. This is the stark difference between fighting a middleweight rogue nation without nuclear weapons versus competing, deterring, and if deterrence fails, fighting and winning a peer fight. And it's why Secretary Wilson and I continue to articulate in every forum that the Air Force is too small for what the nation is asking us to do. It's why we reported to this committee that the Air Force we need to execute the National Defense Strategy requires 386 operational squadrons. With your support of this budget request, we'll continue to rebuild the readiness and lethality of this Air Force, which you supported last year with an on-time appropriation following a damaging sequester and years of budget uncertainty. And for that, we thank you. You know, Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme now and then. My father fought as a young F-4 pilot in Vietnam. He and many of his peers stayed in and rebuilt the Air Force his son needed to fight and win in Desert Storm, followed by 28 years of continual combat operations, including 10 years of Operations Northern and Southern Watch, air campaigns in Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, and continuing through the past 17 years fighting violent extremism in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and North Africa. My daughter and my nephews are young airmen today. With your continued support, with on-time budgets, we'll build the Air Force they'll need to fight and win side by side with our incredible Army in this era of great power competition. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you all. I'll start with the Air Force, sort of building on the main point that both you and the Secretary made, General Goldfein, that I forget the numbers off the top here, but roughly you said we had how many squadrons at this point, Madam Secretary?
Sir, we have 312 operational squadrons.
Right. And you were saying that we needed 388, something like that?
386.
386 to get there. And, you know, I realize the Air Force budget is a little bit complicated because, you know, some of that goes to the intel, some of it goes here. But roughly, I think your budget request is in the $150, $160 billion range. Is that correct?
It's a little above 160. It's a 6.5% increase over last year.
Okay. So I guess the question is, how much would you need in order to have the Air Force that you both say that we don't have but desperately need?
Mm-hmm. If you just look in rough numbers, first of all, we're looking out in the 2025-2030 timeframe, which is what you guided us to do, and to look at the threat in that era.
Just to clarify on that point, so the numbers that you cited earlier about how large you think the Air Force needs to be is to meet the 2025 threat environment, not to meet the current threat environment?
That is correct. You guided us to look in the 2025.
I get what we guided you to do. I'm not asking about that. You basically stated, and it seemed like it was more present tense than future tense when you both were talking about it, that we right now today do not have the Air Force that you think we need to defend the country. And I'm just curious how much more money we would have to spend to get that Air Force. Now, I understand you don't create planes out of whole cloth in the blink of an eye, and it takes time. But putting that point aside, how much more would it cost to have the Air Force that you think we need right now?
Well, if you just look in rough terms, the Air Force we need at 386 squadrons is about 25% larger than the Air Force we have.
Right. And realistically, within the budget, I mean, even assuming, and you got a really good budget in 2019, $717 billion, you know, an increase. I mean, do you realistically think that within the DOD budget and the budget writ large that we're going to be able to get to those kind of numbers? Because it's not just the Air Force that would make that argument about how they don't have enough. How does that factor into what we're realistically going to be able to provide you?
We fully recognize that there are trade-offs that are made, and that the country may not be able to afford the Air Force that we need in order to execute the national defense strategy at moderate levels of risk. What that represents, that gap between the strategy that we have, what's necessary to execute that strategy, and what we really have, represents risk.
Yes.
And that risk is that we will not be able to accomplish the objectives that the combatant commanders have set out in their plans on the timelines that they have asked us to.
And here's the problem I have with that. Now, I won't drill too deeply into this because it could take a long time if I did. So we got a $750 billion budget request from the president. That's a hell of a lot of money. Certainly a lot more than a lot of our adversaries spend. And at the same time we got that, over the course of the last week from all of you, we have been getting, here's the stuff that the $750 billion didn't include. And I haven't done the math on that one, I apologize, but it's a reasonably large number that the Pentagon is now telling us that they can't well, sorry, I overstate that slightly, saying that there is an unacceptable level of risk created by the fact that we're not funding all of the stuff that you're in addition to the $750 billion throwing at it that we put in the budget. My point is, this has no end. Okay. I remember a discussion in this committee between a member who shall remain nameless who wanted Secretary Gates to tell him, stop talking to us about risk, give us the budget that has no risk in it. If Secretary Gates was one given to laughing, he would have. He just finally said, we don't live in that world. You cannot eliminate risk. And to a certain extent, you can always come tell us. I mean, we could spend $1 trillion, and I'm halfway convinced that you'd all be sitting there telling us, okay, that's great, but here's all the things that we can't do. And that frustrates me at a certain point, because I hear about risk, but, you know, I saw the CENTCOM nominee say 3 or 4 months ago, when the number was going to be $733 billion, that anything below $733 billion presented a, quote, unacceptable level of risk. And 2 days later, it was boosted to 750. Which I imagine that anything below 750 would present an unacceptable level of risk. What I'm asking for long term is a better understanding of what risk is. Because we could throw money at you all day long, and you're going to come back at us and say, there's still an unacceptable level of risk. I don't find that helpful. Which brings me to my second point, and that is the audit and the issue of not knowing where this $750 billion is going to go. And it's impossible to overstate this point. We literally don't know where a chunk of that $750 billion is going to go. We can identify some of it here and there, but by any normal accounting measure, you can't tell us where you're spending your money, how much inventory you have. There was, I don't know, something like 427 structures within the DoD disappeared in a year. They were just off the books. So without getting into the broader issue here, what I'd like from, and I'll turn over to the Army now, maybe Secretary Esper, having done the deep dive on your programs that you did, you can tell us what steps could this committee take? And I agree, we're not going to get a full audit. I get that. I understand that, you know, this is probably 60 years worth of mismanagement in terms of accounting and accountability, and we're not going to fix it in a year. I want progress. Okay, is there some piece of the inventory that we could say, okay, let's do a deep dive and figure out this? I understand we don't even use like a normal barcoding system to keep track of what we move within the Pentagon and buy and sell. Is there some steps that we could take that are achievable in the short term to help us have greater confidence on where this 733 or 750 or trillion or whatever it is we decide we want is going to be spent?
Mr. Chairman, I think the audit is very important. I found it very helpful during my time in the private sector. I think it tells you a lot about yourself and your organization. For the first year, we made our way through most of the process. We came up with 429 findings. We now are building corrective action plans for each of these. The Army Corps of Engineers did pass their audit, and based on our progress to date, and we can get into the details as to IT systems, incompatibility, databases, et cetera, but we think that we'll get a clean opinion on our working capital fund in 21 and our general fund in 22.
Okay. But specifically to my question, you know, and I'm sorry, accounting, it's very complicated and difficult. I appreciate the fact that we have at least one accountant on the committee. I think that's enormously helpful. But could you give us a concrete sort of, I don't know, layman's example that says, here's something that was going wrong, we've either fixed it or we're about to fix it, and here's why that's going to help us better understand where the money's going?
Well, what comes to mind is accountability of real estate buildings. And so the databases, first of all, don't necessarily have all the buildings in them. And if they have to talk between installations, I'd have to come back and give you more detail. But in many cases, the databases don't talk. And then you have to go out so we had to hire teams and dispatch them out to each installation to literally walk block by block and count buildings and describe them and try and put a price on them, because it requires a value. And just that inventory process alone takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But we made good progress this year. But then you have to update the databases and make sure they can talk. So at the end of the day, you know what you have and what you don't have, and you can see yourself a whole lot better. To me, that's what's great about an audit. It tells you what you really look like based on your inventory, your real property. You know, we have very good accountability of munitions. That's pretty important. But across the board, that's just one example, and we can provide you more if you'd like.
Yeah. And that's good. And of course, the problem is that it's always easier when you do it on the front end. Okay, so if we'd had these systems set up in place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the incident from like 15 years ago when there were 6 nuclear weapons that were put on, I think it was a B-52, and flown across the country, and nobody knew that it had happened because they didn't have an adequate accounting of where the nuclear weapons were, is perhaps the most alarming example. But, you know, we did, you know, with the buildings. Should have done that when we bought the damn things. Okay, you know, why do you have buildings that you didn't put on the books when you bought them? So going back and fixing that, I think, is enormously important, because then we can have greater confidence in the numbers that you're all talking about in terms of what we need. I could go on, but I won't. Mr. Thornberry.
Let me just follow up on a subset of what the chairman was talking about. In addition to putting more responsibility on the services rather than DOD for the acquisition of things, another major push of this committee in recent years has been to adopt more commercial practices in various ways. Because it turns out that Walmart and others are pretty good at barcodes and keeping track of logistics and various other examples. But part of my frustration is a number of the things we passed into law have not yet been implemented because it takes so long to write the regulations and get through that whole process. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but can either Secretary Esper or Secretary Wilson give me a little hope that the process in implementing what we have already passed to improve these processes is actually picking up pace?
I was going to let her go first, since I'll be able to do this again next year, and she won't. But I would say, Mr. Thornberry, that we are making great use, I think, in the Army, probably all the services, because we meet and talk a lot about this, whether it's the Middle Tier Acquisition Authority, OTAs. We're making a lot of progress on that front. I mean, a purpose why we stood up Army Futures Command was to get outside, out from behind our gates and walls, out into the community, to work more with the commercial sector, the private sector, and particularly young entrepreneurs and innovators. And by the same token, then use that legislation to move quickly. So we've funded quick prototyping. We've been able to bring folks in our version of a Shark Tank, if you will, to help get those innovators in and tie them, get them working with our requirements developers. So we're making good use of it. I think there's some things we need to clear up inside the building to make sure it's as efficient and as timely as possible. But we thank you for the authorities that was given to us.
Mr. Chairman, I would only add to that I think the thing to be cautious about, the Air Force, like the Army, is moving out very quickly and not only using these authorities, but being more transparent and accountable for how we're using them. I think the thing to be cautious about is that old habits die hard, and the thing to watch over the coming years is attempts to take these new authorities and make them look like the way we used to do business. And there are plenty of checkers who are checking the checkers, and that doesn't always add all that much value.
Well, it's something that I want to continue to talk to you all about. Again, what I'm talking about right now are the things we already passed and implementing them in the way that, for the goals that we intended. Let me ask the service chiefs just to comment on one other issue. As has already been noted, the pace of operations, the rising threat, and the declining budgets resulted in a significant, I would say, readiness crisis. We actually lost lives that we need not have lost, in my opinion, because of the combination of those factors. So we together have put more resources into the budget. We have, I hope, started to turn it around, but I think it's important for us to hear from each of you a summary, not in great detail, the progress we've made on the readiness issues and where we are versus where we need to be. Is the job done? Have the last 2 years of increasing budgets and having one on time really got us back to where we need to be when it comes to readiness? Because as one of you said, I can't remember which one, I would interpret it as morally wrong to send somebody out on a mission without the best equipment, the best training, the best support that this nation can provide. And that's on our shoulders as much as y'all's. So I would appreciate General Milley and General Goldfein a snapshot of progress on readiness and where we are versus where we need to be.
Thanks, Congressman. Appreciate the question. In short, about 55%, as Secretary Esper said, we've improved our readiness of our tactical units. When I became Chief of Staff 3.5 years ago, there were 3 brigade combat teams at the highest level of readiness. Today, we've got, roughly speaking, 28 as of about December. So that's a significant improvement, but that's not where we need to be. If we're serious about great power competition, and really the key, we want to be able to win if deterrence fails, but the key is deterrence. You never want the question asked or answered whether you can win or lose against Russia and China. You want to deter the possibility of conflict being raised. So the way to do that is strength, to have large, capable, extraordinarily ready forces that can rapidly deploy and project combat power anywhere on Earth. And then if the enemy or your adversary knows that, then the probability of them taking a risk and crossing some sort of red line won't happen. So for the Army, we have improved our readiness significantly in the last 2 years or so. But you're not going to dig yourself out of a 8 or 10 year hole, plus all the cost of fighting a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera. You're not going to do that in just two budget cycles. This is going to be a sustained level of effort. We think, if all other things remain equal, which of course they never do, we think, though, if they do, that we'll be at the levels of readiness we project, 66% in the regular Army, 33% in the Guard and Reserve, sometime in 22. If we don't get budgets on time, we won't. If we go to a BCA, it'll be catastrophic. We'll revert back to squad and platoon level training, which will increase risk and increase the probability of war. So readiness is all about being able to fight and win, but it's all about deterrence, and that's really what the game is. So we have ways to go, a lot of work to do, and we appreciate your continued support.
Sir, what I would just add to that is that, we stopped the crisis in 18. We sort of leveled off. We began the recovery in 19, and what we're bringing forward in 20 continues and actually accelerates that recovery going forward. For the Air Force, readiness first and foremost is about people. And I know we've had this discussion. We were 4,000 maintainers short, and we're with your support, we have closed that gap to 0. They're young, but we've closed the maintainer gap. And we're also flying more in this budget than we have in the past, so we're moving in the right direction. One of the most important things that Secretary Wilson and I did was we're approaching the additional dollars towards readiness different than we have in the past. In the past, we would have spread that across all squadrons, and then all ships would have rose to a higher tide over time. We determined we couldn't wait that long. So we went back and looked at those squadrons that are required in the opening days of a China or a Russia campaign, labeled them as pacing units, and we took the additional money and put to them first. And as a result of that, we were able to shorten our readiness recovery by 6 years. So today, over 90% of the lead packages for those pacing units required in the opening days of a China-Russia campaign, over 90% of those are ready for combat tasking. The remainder of those pacing units will be ready in 2020. And then we will continue to apply that additional resources as we go forward. And I would just end by saying that we also, for the Air Force, have a very near-term readiness challenge, and that is the impact of readiness if we don't get a supplemental. Because right now we're cash flowing the recovery of Tyndall and Offutt. And as the Secretary is forced to make decisions as we go forward, that is going to have an absolute near-term impact on the readiness of our force.
Well, I appreciate it, and I think it's important to look at what our responsibility in this is as well as y'all's. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for your dedicated and distinguished service, and particularly best wishes as you move on, Dr. Wilson. And with that, I will defer my questions to Ms. Slotkin.
Thank you, Congresswoman. General Milley, I was really glad to hear in your opening statement that you described Russia as, quote, the only current existential threat to the United States. I just want to make sure I have that. It wasn't in your written statement. I just was hoping you could confirm that statement that you read aloud here in front of us.
That's correct, and the reason for that is because of Russian nuclear capability. Now, we have nuclear capability as well. So there's therefore a standoff and mutual deterrence. But because of their nuclear capability, they are the only country on Earth that is capable, I'm not saying they would do it,
Right.
but they are capable of destroying the United States of America.
I just thought it was a really important and striking statement for someone who's going to be our chairman soon. And I hope you maintain that strong focus on that threat as you elevate to the chairman position and keep that independent voice with our president and with others. I wanted to ask both service chiefs, or basically everyone on there. We're about to have NATO's 70th anniversary. We have the Secretary General coming to speak with us, and the conversation around partners and allies and their value to us. I think sometimes the conversation gets caught up in sort of the feel-good pieces of having allies and partners, where I see it as, you know, our allies and partners have a real economic value to us. When they come and fly their F-16s in our operations, that's one F-16 we don't have to fly, right? When they bring their carriers in, when they bring their resources in, that actually lessens the burden on us. And can I have both generals speak to the financial value of fighting in combination with allies and partners?
Well, I'll give you one example that's a real term right now today, and that's the Combined North American Command, NORAD, that protects the homeland with Canada.
Yeah.
And so every day we stand the watch protecting this homeland with our Canadian allies and partners, with the dual-hatted commander at NORTHCOM NORAD. And so that's just one example of how we benefit from it every single day.
I commanded the IJC Corps level headquarters underneath General Dunford in Afghanistan a few years ago, and I think we had 42 allies and partners at the time. Every one of those soldiers that filled a duty position would have otherwise had to have been filled by an American soldier. So that's an example. But more broadly, though, on 19 February 1945, my father hit the beach at Iwo Jima, and 7,000 Marines were killed in 19 days, 34,000 wounded in action in that same time. My mother took care of the wounded coming back. The reason NATO exists is to prevent a war, a great power war. We did 2 of those, World War I and World War II. The reason it went into place is because those people 70 years ago said, we screwed this up. The first half of the last century was a mess. 140, 150 million people killed between 1914 and 1945. We cannot do it again. Allies matter, NATO matters, and working together shoulder to shoulder matters in order to maintain the international order, preserve deterrence, and prevent great power war.
Appreciate that. Turning to the budgets, you know, I think when I'm at home in Michigan, trying to explain increasing budgets to the population back home who feel like they want money invested in different ways. You know, I'm always a huge advocate as someone who's been in the defense world my entire life. But I see the conundrum between the complete lack of uncertainty that you all have to deal with from us, right, and knowing what your budget is going to be year after year, dealing with things like sequestration. And then on the other side, for us and the American public, the lack of transparency because we can't say with a straight face that you all can pass an audit. That, to me, is the conundrum. So I wanted to ask this question. First of all, I'm glad to hear that there is going to be progress on the audit. I can't emphasize enough, as someone who speaks with the general public, if I can say you guys can pass an audit, it's a lot easier to advocate and explain to the American people why the budgets need to keep going up. Would you take the trade-off of more predictability over a 5-year period, concrete predictability, for a lower top line?
Congresswoman, I've never been asked that question before, but I think predictability matters, and particularly given the history of what we've seen in 10 out of the last 11 years, where programs get scrunched and things get stretched out. I think it actually does matter quite a bit. I know how hard it is to think about one-year budgeting.
The gentlelady's time has expired. If you could just summarize quickly.
I think that's it.
Okay, great. Very well done. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for your service, and thank you for being here today. With Secretary Wilson, I was really grateful in serving in the House. We were the Wilson & Wilson team, and so I just wish you best on your future career, and I'm very pleased to find out that the Ranking Member Thornberry is thrilled about your coming to Texas. That's all positive. And Madam Secretary, in October 2018, the Secretary of Defense issued a memorandum directing the Air Force to achieve an 80% mission-capable rate for F-15s, F-22s, and F-35 aircraft by the end of fiscal year 2019. Will the Air Force be able to meet this readiness goal on each of the platforms, and how will it sustain 80% mission-capable rate?
Mr. Chairman and Congressman, there's a couple of things that are conditional now. If we don't end up with a supplemental, it will be extremely difficult to meet those readiness, those mission-capable rates. With respect to the overall plans, we're trying to meet the guidance of the Secretary of Defense, but for the Air Force, we're not just interested in mission-capable rates of pieces of equipment. We're actually looking at the C1 and C2 readiness rates of units. I can have mission-capable aircraft that are sitting in a hangar and it doesn't give us the combat capability that we need. So we look at overall readiness, and the Chief described our readiness recovery plans.
And it's very encouraging to see the focus on readiness. Secretary Esper, I'm grateful to represent the people of the 2nd District of South Carolina, which is the home of Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson trains over 60,000 soldiers per year, with about 10,000 soldiers in basic combat training on any given day. The Army brought in 70,000 troops last year. How are you improving basic training for soldiers at Fort Jackson? Please describe how this budget invests in better trained soldiers so that they can be ready to execute the duties upon arrival at their first duty station.
Yes, sir. So one of the reforms that we made over the past year involves basic training for our infantry soldiers, and this pilot was conducted at Fort Benning, but will find its way to our other posts where we train infantry soldiers. Basically, what we did was this: recognizing the needs of the operational force, we expanded combat basic training, one station unit training, from 14 weeks to 22 weeks by 2 months. We instituted a number of reforms where we changed the program of instruction to reflect the challenges of future warfare, such as fighting in urban warfare environments. We also addressed additional physical training for our soldiers. We lowered the drill sergeant ratio to 12-to-1, and we've seen incredible results from this pilot, and that will eventually work its way to Fort Jackson as well.
That's very encouraging. And, Mr. Secretary, it's very encouraging. The Army plans to field 2 batteries of the Iron Dome system, which was developed in Israel, in the continental United States as an interim solution for the indirect fire protection capability against rockets and cruise missiles. Is the Iron Dome an interim solution or an enduring solution? When do you plan to submit the request to Congress? What would be the impact to national security if the request is not approved?
So, let me, if I could, Congressman, just
yes, General.
Comment on that. Iron Dome is a very capable system. It's got basically 100% track record in combat. We clearly need it to protect our formations, and we are buying the 2 batteries as mentioned. They'll be coming online here next year, in 20. It's part of this budget. And we'll have the first unit equipped, and we'll employ them as necessary.
Well, it's an extraordinary system, and this is very encouraging.
It's very good.
And General, how is the Army progressing toward the goal of ensuring 66% of the force is rated as meeting full-spectrum readiness requirements? Will the Army reach this by fiscal year 2022?
I believe yes, unless, if the international environment remains as it is right now, and we get predictable budgets on time at the amounts requested, then I think we will, our estimate is, the Army's estimate is, that we'll achieve the 66% and 33% for the Guard and Reserve by sometime in 2022. The key components are manning, training, and equipping, as you well know. Equipping has come along very, very well with these budgets. We've increased the pace and op-tempo of training. We've reorganized the CTCs and the amount of time Guard and Reserve. The long pole in the tent has always been manning. And it remains manning. So we want to get the formations that we do have on the books. We want those manned at 100% strength for all the combat units, brigade and below, by 2022. And once we achieve that, we'll look at other formations.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony today, and most especially I want to thank you all for your service to the country. Madam Secretary, in particular, we've had the opportunity to work together both on the HIPSI and the HASC, and I appreciate the great contributions you made to our national security, and wish you well as you transition now into the next chapter of your career. And General Milley, I just want to take the opportunity to publicly congratulate you on becoming the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Look forward to our continued working relationship as well. If I could start, Secretary Wilson, you recently testified that the recovery and reconstruction of Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases, which have been devastated by extreme weather and flooding, will cost nearly $5 billion. The FY18 NDAA requires that the Department of Defense describe future-focused mitigations needed to ensure mission resiliency and their cost. Unfortunately, the Department of Defense has failed significantly to meet its statutory mandate on this report, and I'm concerned that we're now in a cycle of throwing good money after bad. The lack of foresight with regard to investments, in my opinion, in resiliency is not only fiscally irresponsible, but places our service members and our readiness at risk. So my question is really to all of our witnesses, and I don't want anybody filibustering. I want to try to get to these as quickly as possible. I have several. Do you agree that the changing climate poses a threat to our readiness? Secretary Esper?
I'm not sure that I could say that it poses a threat to our readiness, but climate change is something we have to take into account as we consider our installations, our training ranges, and how and where we may fight in the future.
General Milley?
I would say climate change, the effects of climate change are things that we have to consider at the strategic, operational, tactical level and all of our military operations in the future.
Secretary Wilson?
I agree we have to take it into account. For the Air Force, weather and weather effects from the South Pole to the deserts of the Middle East is something we have to deal with and predict every day.
General?
I'll just add that we're a land-based force that's globally, we have a global footprint, and so we're watching everywhere, and especially in the Arctic, where we have a significant footprint and the effects there.
So to each of you, are you planning and making investments in the FY20 budget in order to mitigate the risks that we will face in the short, medium, and long term to our CONUS and OCONUS installations? Secretary Esper?
Mr. Langevin, we are doing work at our installations consistent with our installation management plans, but I have to go back and bring you back more detail to lay that out more clearly for you.
Okay, I welcome that answer when you have a chance to get up to speed on it. General?
Same thing. We'll have to get back to you for the record, Congressman.
Secretary Wilson?
Congressman, when we are rebuilding Tyndall, we're trying to rebuild it in a way that is resilient, and we actually have a new infrastructure investment strategy that tries to make our bases resilient because we fight from our bases, and they have to be resilient to all kinds of adversaries, including the weather.
In general?
Yeah, same.
Okay. I would hope that we are building resiliency in, that we're planning ahead. I mean, climate change, whether people want to recognize it or not, it's happening, and we are going to be throwing good money after bad if we do not plan. Whether a base should be rebuilt or we build it, resiliency in, it has to be done because it's going to be a waste of taxpayer dollars if we don't, and it's going to affect our mission readiness, I'm convinced. So what I want to ask, Secretary Esper, let me switch to this. Let me ask you, how are you evaluating those risks as they evolve? How are you prioritizing your budgets? And can you commit to providing a briefing in the coming month on this topic and the methodologies that you are using?
Congressman, you're referring with regard to the impacts of climate change.
Yes, and your planning and how you're building.
Yes, sir. We will commit to coming back and briefing you.
Okay. And Secretary, or whoever.
Congressman, I would say that, for example, in our infrastructure strategy, when we look at a base's resilience, we look at its at how is it. We're doing some things in the Arctic with respect to making sure permafrost stays permanent. I was just at Offutt Air Force Base, and because of the backup power systems we put in, Stratcom and the new Stratcom headquarters didn't miss a beat, even though a third of the base was being flooded by the terrible storms that
again, I
hit
apologize.
Nebraska.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilson, it's great to see you. It's great to have you here before us as Secretary of the Air Force. We're all saddened that you're departing, but I look forward to when you return as Secretary of Defense. I'm going to say that everywhere I go because I think you truly, with your background and expertise, I think are very poised to be the first female head of the Secretary of Defense, and I look forward to when we welcome you here at that time. General Goldfein, you have stated, I think most eloquently, about the budget that we're facing and the real costs if the number should go down. We've seen budget proposals as $750 billion. We've seen $733. There have been some who've said it could even be lower. You've made it clear that this is not a luxury, that there are real hard things that would be devastating the Air Force if this number goes down. Could you please share those thoughts with us?
Yes, sir. And all the Joint Chiefs, as we have gotten together to talk in the tank with Chairman Dunford, we have all aligned with the fact that at a 3% real growth, it allows us to maintain our current capability. 5% growth actually allows us to both modernize and really improve readiness. The impact of the instability. We talked earlier about the impact of the services and our ability to plan ahead, and that's a real challenge for us.
But General, you've talked about like we will lose specific things. There are things that will be affected in your capabilities if this number drifts downward. Could you speak to those?
Yes, sir. There will be flying hours that we will lose, which are a direct impact on readiness. There will be aircraft modernization that we will lose, which we absolutely need to stay ahead of the threat. And there will be significant impacts on our investment in space, which is significant as we go forward to transition from a benign environment to a contested environment.
Good, thank you. Secretary Wilson, as you know, I'm the past chair of the Air and Land Subcommittee, so I'm very dedicated to our work to go to fifth-generation aircraft in the F-35. I'm disappointed, obviously, in the number of aircraft that the Air Force is currently looking to acquire for the F-35. Prior budget request indicated that you should be probably at 60. The request we get is 48. I just wanted to have a discussion with you that we all know about F-35 production and just get your confirmation of my thoughts here. If we don't buy more F-35s next year, we can't buy more than next year, right? I mean, because every year that we put off increasing the amount of F-35s that we buy, the supply chain doesn't keep up, the production line doesn't keep up, and we put off the ability for us to ramp up to where we would have both increased cost savings and also increased numbers of F-35 that we can put into service. Do you have some concerns that as we continue to put off buying higher numbers of F-35 that we're really just locking in increased costs, locking in inefficiency, and making it more difficult for us to have the flexibility to do that later?
Congressman, I'm not sure that I'm concerned so much about those effects. I do think that the Air Force is committed to the F-35. We need its game-changing capability. We also need both capacity and capability. And one of the things that we're facing now, let's go back a second. It was before any of all of us were here, really, but it was the F-22 was supposed to replace the F-15. That didn't entirely happen, and those decisions are made and behind us. The reality is we've got F-15Cs that are not going to live long enough to get replaced. The consequence would be that our force structure will decline in size. The best thing we think we can do, given the resources that we have, is to buy the 48 F-35s this year and to supplement them by replacing the F-15Cs.
Okay, well, I didn't raise the F-15 because I really think it should not be an apples and oranges discussion. As we were having discussion earlier, in fact, you had represented that you thought that the choices of of modernizing or buying new F-15s shouldn't be at the cost of the F-35, which is why I wanted to walk you through if we buy 48 aircraft this year and not 60, doesn't it make it more difficult to buy 78 the next year? I mean, isn't it absolutely that we lock ourselves into an inability to have flexibility to increase the number of the F-35s by what we do this year?
Congressman, as I understand it, now we had our folks check with Lockheed, could they build 60 this year, in the FY20 year? And the answer is yes, they could. So as far as flexibility in the supply chain, I think at least at that level, that kind of flexibility exists. I'd also maybe ask the Chief to talk a little, including about the UPL.
But it does, General, affect the next year, right? I mean, if they could do 60 this year, but we only buy 48, aren't they going to come back and say, well, we could do 60 next year versus we could do 78 next year? I mean, we're pushing off the inevitability of the ramp up that we're losing by us pulling that line forward.
Yes, sir. I can't speak for industry, but my understanding of how they invest in their workforce, in addition to the tooling in the line, is that they invest year to year, and so it would be more difficult to go to. The larger the jump, the more difficult it will be for industry.
Secretary Wilson, you've done an excellent job in trying to lower the cost of sustainment for the F-35. I know the problems that we've had with the Alice system that you're working on. Could you give us a short update on that?
The Air Force is using its software factory called Kessel Run and working with Lockheed to jump forward to development ops and get more capability to Alice faster. And the first drop of software, I believe, is this month.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. They seem determined, Secretary Wilson, to ask you the question with like no time left and then force you to answer that. So I appreciate your flexibility on that. I do want to have just one point of clarification, and maybe General Goldfein. Is it your testimony that you not feel that the Department of Defense can adequately defend the country for $733 billion?
Sir, I absolutely believe that we can defend the country today. I think the question that you you specifically asked us was, what does the Air Force need in the 25 to 30 time frame
and I'm going,
to be able to adequately defend?
Right, and I apologize. I'm going bigger picture here than just your individual budgets. And General Milley, as the soon-to-be chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, I mean, we've heard testimony about a bunch of numbers. Do you think you can adequately defend the country for $733 billion in the FY20 budget, forgetting the future for the moment, just talking about the FY20 budget?
I think the Army's component of the defense of the United States, what we were asking for, the answer is yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses. I would like to ask Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein a very simple question. Are you in favor of the Pentagon's current proposal for a Space Force?
Yes.
Yes.
So I thought your testimony was interesting. On page 9, you say you use the passive voice here. The Department of Defense recently submitted legislation to establish the Space Force as a new armed services within the Department of the Air Force. You didn't seem as enthusiastic in that paragraph as in some other paragraphs.
That was, I'm not really sure what to say about the use of the passive voice. Maybe my English teacher would be upset with me. But the point is that the proposal came from the Department of Defense. It wasn't something that we just wrote. That was all I was trying to say.
Congressman, can I offer that when the President gave guidance, we spent several months within the Department of Defense debating, a very robust debate on where we would land to get in line with his guidance. And that was everything from the initial guidance of a separate service, separate department, and everything that comes with that, to a JAG Corps, Medical Corps, and everything in between. Where we landed from a warfighter's perspective is a recognizable place to have a service that stands up within the Department of the Air Force. That decision was made just prior to the legislative proposal coming forward. And so since then, we've been directed by the Secretary of Defense to do the detailed planning associated with what this force looks like. And that detailed planning is weeks old.
More use of the passive voice. You said the decision was made. So I want to know whether the Air Force will be enthusiastic about the Space Force proposal, or are you being dragged kicking and screaming to support this?
I think the fact that we are having a national debate about space is is absolutely necessary. It's needed, and I give the President and the administration a lot of credit for raising this level of conversation of the one we're having.
I'm not hearing anyone being dragged, but I am hearing some gritting of teeth.
So there's no gritting of teeth here. This is from a warfighter's perspective, and as someone, you're not going to have many folks sit in front of you who have actually employed space capabilities in combat, like I have as the Space Coordinating Authority for Central Command. And let me just tell you that the path that we're on and where we're going is the right path.
So it's wholehearted and full-throated support.
Yes, sir.
Whoa. So although the previous estimate had been you needed $13 billion to do it, the $2 billion that's in the Pentagon's proposal now is sufficient.
Congressman, let me talk to you a little bit about cost estimates. We were asked to come forward with the cost estimates for a variety of pieces of proposals. That includes the stand-up of a unified combatant command, which has already been approved by Congress, and it included everything that would go towards making a fully standalone department. The proposal that the President approved does not create a full standalone department. It creates a service underneath the Air Force, and one of the benefits of that is that it costs less money.
Well, we like things like in the Army testimony, doing more with less. That's an awesome position to be in. I hope we can do it here. If memory serves, the record of the Air Force in regard to the Space Force is first opposition, then support once the President came on board, now full-throated, wholehearted support, although at different budget numbers. Is the current Pentagon proposal, is it unamendable? Is it perfect? Or should Congress weigh in with substantial changes?
Congressman, I think that there is a proposal which we support. We also recognize that this is a conversation and that legislation is required by this committee, by the House, and by the Senate. And we are open to discussing those things with all of you.
Finally, in the short time remaining, how urgent is this request? How quickly do we need to act in order to prevent the U.S. from falling further behind?
Congressman, I think the most important thing is the programmatic changes that you approved in fiscal year 19 and the elements in the budget. We also believe that this is the year to go ahead and make the changes that are needed with respect to organizational structure, and we will work with you to accomplish that.
Sir, can I add just in a few seconds, of all of the work we have ahead of us, the most important work we do right now is stand up the new combatant commander, because that normalizes the business of warfighting going forward. As we get that, every other action we take now follows that and aligns with where we need to go.
Thank you.
Mr. Rogers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Goldfein, you're absolutely right. I agree with you on that. General Milley, first of all, thank all of you for your service. General Milley, congratulations on your promotion. I wanted to ask you, we all know that the Army's Future Combat System and ground combat vehicle programs were failures. How and why will the optionally manned fighting vehicle be different?
I think the key is that, number one, the technologies have advanced to a level where we have confidence. Secondly, is we are doing a lot of experimenting and prototyping. And that's fundamentally different than what happened with, as you noted, with FCS. With FCS, we got out in front of our headlights, and in the sense that we were trying to demand a requirement in a vehicle for which the technology wasn't mature. We know factually that optionally manned or robotic vehicles work today. They're working in the commercial world. They're driving and delivering goods and services up and down the highways and byways of America, even as we speak. So it does work. Driving on a highway is a little bit different than driving through the hinterlands or the mountains or the terrain of the Earth's surface, or in some urban areas that might be a result of combat operations. So there's some more research, development, science, technology that has to be done in order for these robotic vehicles to negotiate that type of terrain. And there are some more challenges, so I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. But we're very, very confident it's going to work. And the vehicles that we think will come off the production line here in the not-too-distant future will have great capability to be optionally manned.
Okay, it appears that the U.S. is finally going to withdraw from the INF Treaty. Does the Army intend to remove the previously imposed range restrictions on your long-range precision fire initiatives that complied with that treaty heretofore?
Congressman, if and when we depart from the treaty, the Army is prepared to move forward and extending the range of our precision strike missile, for example.
Great. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time to Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Secretary Esper, last week we received the Army's unfunded requirements list, and the railhead at Fort Drum was at the top of this list. That's a project that I have very much supported. Can you explain why infrastructure projects such as this railhead at Fort Drum did not make it into the budget request, and what you are doing in the interim to ensure that units like the 10th Mountain Division maintain the capability to rapidly deploy in response to worldwide threats?
Right, I'll take the first stab at it and then let the Chief do as well. So on improvements such as that, MILCON, the wants and needs always exceed the resources, and we try and prioritize them based on readiness and power projection. Clearly for our installations, they are and Fort Drum is one of them, of course. They are places by which we project power forward. The Army's first thing it needs to do anywhere it goes is deploy. We have to get there, which means getting first from the fort to the port and then port to overseas. So we rack and stack those, and we put them in the order based on what we think the mobilization process looks like and the timelines for deployment. And that's how we come up with that list. And that's likely how it made it onto the UFOR list, if you will.
General Milley?
Just a process note. Each of the service chiefs submit the UFOR list, the unfunded requirements list, based on our assessment of risk and our chief's assessment of risk that feeds into the chairman's annual risk assessment. So everything's related to risk, as was pointed out by Chairman Smith early on. With respect to Fort Drum, as you know, commanded up at Fort Drum, that railhead's very important. 10th Mountain Divisions are strategically deployable, rapidly deployable division-size capability, and that railhead is critical to getting the troopers from the 10th Mountain Division out the door. So we want to make sure it's up on there. However, within the UFOR list, I decided to put that on there as one of many things that I think would improve our readiness if additional monies became available. How does it rack and stack to the $182.3 billion of requirements that we put into the budget? It was just below the cut line on the 182.3, but if additional monies became available, it's on that UFOR list. And would like to see it funded if possible.
Absolutely. So I will continue to prioritize that project and fight for appropriations when it comes to the MILCON budget. With 30 seconds left, I'll ask a question for the record, and you can submit written response. Secretary Wilson and Secretary Esper, I'm curious to hear your thoughts and feedback on the transition to the Defense Health Agency. What challenges have your services faced, and what lessons can we learn from that transition? This is something that we understand deeply in the North Country in New York, given that Fort Drum is one of the only Army installations without a hospital on post. We work with civilian hospitals. General Milley, of course, is very familiar with this model, but I'll take that for the record and look forward to reading your written response. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses this morning. Particular, Secretary Wilson, congratulations on your service and leaving on your own terms, which is the best way to end your chapter, and I'm sure you're going to do great things in the future. After listening to all the Texas talk this morning, I just want to say congratulations to General Milley. It's nice to see a citizen of Red Sox Nation leading the Joint Chiefs. And General Goldfein, in July 2017, a Marine Corps KC-130 crashed and took the lives of 17 service members. The Navy, in the wake of that, requested and Congress appropriated funding to replace the legacy propellers on the entire C-130 fleet. I know the Air Force temporarily grounded the Air National Guard C-130s, but it's very unclear whether or not you are going to proceed along the same path in terms of replacing those propellers, which certainly was identified as a contributing factor in terms of the crash. Could you clarify what the Air Force position is and whether you're going to proceed in terms of replacing those propellers?
Yes, thank you, sir. So what we found as a result of the accident investigation was that propellers procured before or made before 1971 need to be replaced. We've completed the replacements of all of those. The propeller that we're looking at, and we're doing the acquisition strategy right now, is the NP2000. It's an 8-bladed propeller, and we started off with a business case analysis. We're actually now working through the acquisition strategy because we think it's the right strategy going forward to replace all of the propellers in the C-130H community with that.
Well, that's good to hear because the propeller that was involved in that crash was actually a 1980s propeller. So I think really, just let's just move forward. And I'm glad to hear your answer this morning. On March 14th, Dr. Roper came before Sea Power and Projection Forces and talked about the foreign object debris that was found at the KC-46 tanker. At that point, he had just visited a Boeing factory and said that he felt that their processes were valid. Unfortunately, 11 days later, they found a second incident involving foreign object debris. Could you talk about what the Air Force's response is to that second incident?
Thank you, Congressman. We actually stopped again the acceptance of the KC-46s because of foreign object debris that we found in some closed compartments. We've got corrective action in place, including a 100% look at some of those closed compartments to make sure that the production line is being run the way that it needs to be run.
Great. Well, I know you had made some pretty optimistic projections about full delivery, and it just seems these keep sort of getting in the way. And hopefully, we're just going to make sure that the oversight continues as strong as possible. I'd like to go back to the Space Force proposal because in the budget document that was submitted, Section 1707, I mean, there's some pretty extraordinary transfer authorities which the administration is proposing. In fact, 7-year blanket funding that would allow DOD to move funding from anywhere in the department to the Space Force as long as it's somehow connected. Given what's going on right now in terms of the heartburn surrounding the transfer authority for border projects, why can't we just do a 1-year transfer and then do normal budgeting? Why is 7-year transfer authority part of this proposal?
Mr. Chairman and Congressman, we'll obviously work with you on those kinds of specifics of the proposal, but we do need more than 1-year transfer authority, or at least we think we do. We're in the midst of doing all of the detailed planning the Chief referred to. We have a team that stood up within the Air Force to go through all of the details of what would be required when.
Because obviously that sort of changes the budget projection that, again, we just discussed here a moment ago. If there's transfer authority of that sweeping in nature, I mean, actually the costs could be far different than what was put into the budget and as a line item. Just again, Secretary, Army Secretary, thank you for being here today. Again, we just had a discussion regarding the Fort Drum construction issue, which was left out of the budget. Again, that unfunded projects list that came over from the Army last week coincided with the $1 billion transfer for border construction. How do you balance moving money out of the Department of the Army at the same time you're coming back to Congress saying by the way, there's unfunded priorities, such as the Fort Drum project?
Right, I understand. Yes, sir. Well, Congressman, we didn't move the money out of the Army. When we realized we had a military personnel wedge of about $1 billion, we apprised Congress. We have certainly notified OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, of that. And as they are more often than not to do, they take that wedge from us and use it for broader DOD priorities.
And without even consulting Congress, by the way, which again is a very big breach of normal practice around here. And I frankly think it's going to do damage to transfer reprogramming
and while I
in the future.
Ms. Courtney's point, his time has expired. So, well made. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wilson, I know the folks at University of Texas El Paso will be happy to have you, and the school will be well served by your future service there. So welcome back to Texas, or welcome to Texas, I guess. You were almost there when you were in New Mexico. I need to add a couple of comments about the audit issue that's been discussed here before. The real full court press on getting that done began when Leon Panetta was secretary. He was the one who really started the ball rolling and communicated that to the leadership. I've been watching to make sure that subsequent changes in leadership, that each one of the new leaders gave the kind of full-throated support that's going to continue to be necessary to get this done. And while there's a lot left to be done, there has been a lot done. And good, hard-working men and women in uniform and civilians have been at this process for a long time. And I don't want our comments here to discourage them or think that we haven't recognized that an awful lot has been done. 18 was the first year that the whole thing was under audit. That's a big deal. Secretary Esper, I know you mentioned some 400 plus NFRs. Individuals have been assigned to each one of those to make sure that they're done. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, and they're preparing corrective action plans for each of those to make sure we get them done in a timely manner.
And I assume the Air Force has done a very similar thing, Ms. Wilson?
Yes, sir.
And so tracking those, that work, they all have timelines, they all have ways to get at it, and that will get us even closer to getting the books and records audited. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir, based on the timeline I gave Chairman Smith earlier.
I got you. The good work, but truth of the matter is the systems, many of those legacy systems were created in an environment when auditing was not an issue. It was never to be expected. The systems complied with the Appropriations Act, with the Anti-Deficiency Act. So we do know, we just don't toss money in a bucket and not know where it's at, but we can't audit it. And that meant setting up internal control systems that could be audited so that you don't have to check every single transaction. You can count on the system to work, and those have been put in process. So I just want to give a pat on the back for the hardworking men and women throughout your agencies that are getting this thing done. Long way to go, and we got to keep the pressure on them. That pressure comes from the top, and I appreciate each of the four of you, your attention to this. It's percolated all the way down further in the systems. I've told this story before. I was on the USS Texas, and we were doing a bit of a town hall meeting in the galley, and a young seaman asked me, Chairman, what about that audit thing doing? How's it working? Well, I don't know if that was put up on that, but if a young seaman on the galley of the USS Texas knows about the audit issue, then we are making progress. General Milley, last week, the acting secretary is here, and the budget drops the end strength of the Army by almost 8,000. Can you speak with a little bit of granularity as to what that means? General Goldfein mentioned 4,000 maintainers short. What happens to our Army when they can't recruit the additional 8,000 that would have been there had you been able to recruit them?
Thanks, Congressman. Let me put in a little bit of context. We were able to recruit 70,000 soldiers into the Army last year. That's a 10-year high. And yes, we missed the mark by 6,500, but we did that because I set the bar too high on an unachievable goal. Secretary Mattis and others cautioned us against that, by the way. They thought that the bar was being set too high, and in fact, it proved to be that way. So we had a very, very ambitious goal last year, and we came up short. But we did achieve a 10-year high. That's 70,000. That's bigger than the Australian and Canadian armies combined. So it wasn't like we had a bad recruiting year. We just missed the mark that we set. Having said that, the key point for us is to fill the holes in the existing force structure, fill the manning holes. We have some units, when I became the Chief of Staff of the Army, that were going to major training events at 65 or 70% strength. That's unacceptable. We need units going to training at greater than 90% strength. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we're filling them at 100% strength. We've also taken action to reduce our non-deployables significantly. When I became the Chief, we had 140, 150,000 non-deployable soldiers. That's been dropped down considerably. So what was 17% high on average for units and non-deployables is now down around 6 or 7%. So it's recruiting, retention, reduction in non-deployables, and ensuring our soldiers are ready to go. That resolves the manning issue for the Army to fill the holes in the existing units.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. I yield back.
Thank you. I think it's my turn, the Chairman not being here. General Milley, congratulations on your appointment. We await your confirmation. General Goldfein, as always, your service is much appreciated. Secretary Wilson, you're on to new things. El Paso awaits you, and we will miss you. Esper, you and I are going to be together. So we look forward to that. General Milley, in your testimony, you said that you need $4 to $5 billion this coming year for modernization. Long-range precision fires, $1.3 billion, combat vehicles, and so forth. In your testimony, Secretary Wilson, you mentioned the problems at Tyndall and Offutt. You didn't mention the fact that the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune was also devastated. Total cost of recovery from those three bases is somewhere around $8 billion. And I assume it's a priority because those are key bases for the American military and our security. What I don't understand is why the $1 billion from the U.S. Army personnel account was transferred to the counter-narcotics account so it can then be used to build a border wall. When you're giving us testimony that the recovery of these bases is absolutely essential. And I don't understand. So I'm going to ask specifically Secretary Wilson, what is your view of the transfer of that $1 billion from the Army personnel account to build a wall rather than to backfill the $740 million that you've had to spend to clean up Tyndall Air Force Base? Could it be better spent at Tyndall?
We have had, and I can't think of a time when I was here, and certainly in my service in the Air Force, where we've had a natural disaster like we've seen hit Lejeune and Tyndall and Offutt when there wasn't a supplemental to help with that. And we didn't take it from other parts of the service or other parts of the department. So I think we need a supplemental to recover from the storm damage.
I won't press you, but in fact, the money is already in the Department of Defense. The decision was made to transfer it for the construction of 150 miles of border fence rather than Tyndall, Offutt, or Lejeune. Secretary Esper, what was your view of that transfer? Was it the proper thing to do? Is it more important to build a border wall than to transfer the $1 billion to the Marines for the repair of Camp Lejeune?
Congressman, that's not my call to make. My perspective is prioritization within the Army. Obviously, Acting Secretary Shanahan has a broader perspective because he sees all of DOD, and of course, the White House has a national perspective. So, my ability to prioritize within the Army is what we did. I will tell you the FY19 appropriations from which that was taken meets our...
Excuse me for interrupting. Yes, specifically, the money was in the Army account. Could it have been transferred to long-range precision fires, or maybe combat vehicles, or vertical lift, or maybe air missile defense? Could it have been transferred there for those purposes to specifically serve the military's need for high-effect combat with our near-peer adversaries?
Yes, sir, but there's two qualifiers here. One, of course, is it came from the military personnel account. They were soldiers we did not have. And so that's point number one. The FY19 budget satisfied our readiness and modernization needs as presented to you all last year. The second thing is we came across this in September or October and turned it over to OSD at that time. So this is well before any consideration of, at least to the best of my knowledge, of reallocating money to the 284 account came about.
So the money could be better spent on a 100-mile fence rather than on all the other needs that the U.S. Army has?
Again, not my call.
Fort Drum?
Yes, sir. Not my call, Congressman. Again, I see the priorities within the Army.
So it's not your responsibility how money is spent within the U.S. Army?
It is, but you're asking me to make a relative value choice between the Army and a border wall.
Why were we not notified of this transfer?
I can't answer that question, Congressman. I'd have to refer you to OSD.
Final point is that do not expect transfer authorities in the coming year. Do not expect transfer authorities in the coming year because of what has happened this year. I yield back my time. I see the chairman is.
Thank you. Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilson, sorry to see you're leaving. First of all, as somebody that went on the Codell to Red Flag, I wish everybody on this committee was there. Great insight. Everybody knows I'm the dumbest Marine in the world, and I learned more about the Air Force. And if you weren't all in with the F-35, talking to those pilots, and everything else, and a lot of it, obviously, it was all in a classified mode. It was fantastic, so I encourage you to do it again. I did have a couple of questions about those Australian AWACS. they look like something out of Star Wars, are we evaluating those their capabilities compared with our old AWACS, a system that's probably older than me, if there is such a thing?
Congressman, it's called a wedge tail, and maybe
Yeah.
I'll ask the chief to talk a little bit about advanced battle management and where we're going. We don't just think about particular platforms anymore, but how do we merge data from multiple platforms to get from any sensor to any shooter really quickly?
So I'll just tell you that last year we brought to you a significant change in the way we plan to do business in the future. And the question we asked was, how do we ensure that a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine that's on the ground inside of defended airspace will have visibility on enemy movement on day one of a campaign? And the current platform-centric approach is not going to be viable past the next few years because the enemy can hold it too far out to be able to do its job. So we're transitioning from a platform-centric approach to a fusion of sensors and capabilities so that that soldier that's inside enemy airspace has visibility on day one. Therefore, when we talk about platforms, wedge tails and other kind of platforms, you will see the Air Force shifting more to a family of systems than a single platform solution.
Thank you. General Milley, the active protective systems. You know, I'm a big fan of that. I've been after that for years. I guess, are we stopping at 4 armored brigades as opposed to moving on to what, the 11 or 12 that I was kind of hoping we'd get for the Abrams?
Short answer is no. We intend to put active protective system on every armored vehicle in the United States Army over time. The 4 is the interim. It's a waypoint en route to equipping the entire armored force with active protective systems.
By the way, I want to compliment the Army on the outstanding job they've done. And I remember 6 years ago when we were talking about readiness and all the units were C3, C4. It was absolutely horrible. And to come as far as you have, I think is just outstanding. I still hold a grudge against you on the fact on our trip to Europe that you deliberately skipped our trip to Belleau Wood on the Marine Corps birthday, and I understand that it was an all-Army trip, and I had to go into depression training for a month, but really, I just can't compliment you enough on how far the Army has come in readiness. It's all about readiness, and I know that we're going to have some issues. I'm worried about the number of the buy, like everyone else, on the F-35. And I think of the evil word sequester. My mother was still alive, and I said that she'd rinse my mouth out with soap. And I think that speaks volume on how I feel about that. We're going to have some challenges with the NDAA, but very, very happy with the panel and some of the things that have been done, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank all the witnesses. Secretary Wilson, thank you for your service. Much appreciated and had a great relationship. And General Milley, on your nomination, it's good to see a New Jersey educated, since we're doing the states, a good Princeton grad on your nomination. But we've sat here over the last 2 cycles and heard so much about the next generation, 5th generation fighters. I know, General Goldfein, you and I have had this discussion, and the same thing with you, Secretary Wilson, is that now, after hearing that time after time, there is a shift and a start of the F-15E. And the discussion had been that the deterioration of the seas are going a bit quicker than you expected. But that happened in approximately the last 9 months, and I continue to get questions from those on my subcommittee and the full committee. How could this change have happened rapidly and so soon that the retirement, if you look at an airframe to an airframe, it's an equal. But do you consider the F-15 and the F-35 equal when it comes to a near-peer competitor if we were to go to war with China or Russia?
Sir, no, and not even close. Here's the situation we found ourselves in. You won't find a stronger proponent of the F-35 than the current Chief Staff of the Air Force. It is a game changer. But we have to look at it as part of a penetrating joint team that doesn't travel alone. This F-35 is going to be inside of enemy airspace. You know, sometimes we're guilty of placing a red dome on a PowerPoint chart as though a country can keep us out. The best they can ever do is actually put a block of Swiss cheese because there's holes there. And it's our job to know where they are and get in and exploit them. And the quarterback of the penetrating joint team that is capable of doing that we bought to do that can fuse information and call the audibles we need, is the F-35. But you got to look at it from the F-35 plus the B-21 plus the RQ-170 plus the X-37 plus a brigade combat team plus a soft team plus a tactical submarine. We've invested $135 billion in this budget over the FYDP in penetrating capability. But the challenge we find ourselves in is we need both penetrating and standoff. And 4 aircraft have to fly into the 2030s to give us the capacity we need to fight and win. The A-10, the F-15E, the F-16, and the F-15C. The F-15C is not going to make it. So what we found ourselves with was a capacity shortfall. And we started by saying we are going to keep the F-35 on our program of record. We are the largest customer. We're a tough customer, and our program of record is 1763, and now we're not backing off an inch, and we're not putting a dime of the F-35 into anything else but what we need to do with the F-35. But we have a capacity challenge. Those F-15Cs are not going to make it. And when we look at options on the table, we have a hot line of F-15EXs, F-15Es. The Saudis and the Qataris have put money into a hot line, and when you look at the operating costs over time, it became the most affordable solution to fill a short-term capacity shortfall. Yes, sir.
So you talk about the sustainability, the operational. If the costs, which continue to come down on the F-35, will now be somewhat slower because you're investing in the F-15. So how did this come, not in the last 4 years, but in the last 9 months? That's what people keep asking me is, how did this all of a sudden, in the last 9 months, change to the last 48 months?
So I think it's important to start with what hasn't changed. And the chairman made the same comment, I believe, in his testimony, is what has not changed is our commitment to the F-35. We just have a capacity shortfall that we have to solve in the time frame we have to solve it. We looked at the best cost estimates that we had available to us, which not only procurement, but also operations and sustainment. And by having an F-15 variant replace an F-15, same construction, same hangars, same operating and support equipment, same maintainers, so the transition costs are minuscule, and so therefore, in terms of time and readiness, as long as we do this on top as a small slice on top of the F-35 and the other penetrating joint capability, this gives us more combat lethality. This is not an either-or discussion. This is an additive discussion.
I'm almost out of time, but we're going to have further discussion because we need to make sure we're making what little investment we can make goes the right way, particularly when it comes to that 5th-generation fighter. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for the service you provided our country. And Secretary Wilson, you will be missed. I enjoyed serving with you in Congress, and I enjoyed working with you in your current position. I wish you the best in the future. For General Goldfein and General Milley, the fiscal year 2020 budget proposal goes a long way towards rebuilding our forces toward readiness and finally investing in modernization, but we still have a long ways to go. We've talked about the risk involved if we don't have $750 billion, but can you be specific as possible with what capabilities are at risk if we do not have that top line amount of 750, what training risks we incur, and what risks we would incur in the event, God forbid, of a major conflict?
So I'll start off. First of all, let's talk training. For an Air Force, we train both virtually and on our ranges. And on those ranges, we've got to be able to replicate the threat that we would expect to meet if we were to send airmen into harm's way. And so what would be at risk is our ability to replicate that threat with the proper environment, both virtually and physically on our ranges going forward. What's also, I think, is a risk is the significant movement that we started last year, and Congress supported this. And it was a significant move for the Air Force to shift from a platform solution on command and control and battle management to a network solution going forward. That is our future in the business of joint warfighting, is to ensure that we are taking every sensor and every shooter and connecting them together so that we can have better decisions and bring effects from all domains simultaneously to overwhelm an adversary. And it has as much of a deterrent effect as it has a warfighting and winning effect. That will be at risk with lower budgets.
Congressman, I would say in terms of manning, we would likely have to trim back and not fill the holes that we've been filling. In terms of training, your larger scale operations or training exercises will be trimmed back in various places, not only in the continental United States like at NTC or JRTC, but also overseas. Right now, for example, we're doing our first emergency deployment readiness exercise, deploying an Armored Brigade combat team out of Fort Bliss, Texas, all the way to Europe. First time that's been done in probably 25, 30, maybe even 40 years. Exercises like that would come down. In terms of equipping, spare parts, which are critical to keep our vehicles and helicopters flying, those would probably slow down as well. And I suspect that the broader categories of readiness would degrade proportionate to the amount of money that was less in the budget. On a broader scale, you asked about conflict with the near peer. The way we evaluate risk is task, time, and troops. So can the United States Army, in this case, accomplish the task that the combatant commander asks it to do in the various war plans? Yes or no? Can it accomplish the task? And we know that through various war games, et cetera. Can you do it on time, on the timelines required by the war games? And can you do it at an acceptable level of cost expressed in casualties of U.S. forces? We do all those calculations, spend a whole year doing all that. That results in our annual risk assessments that are classified, reported to Congress, Secretary of Defense, and so on. And I would argue that if the budgets were to drop precipitously or significantly, that the levels of risk would proportionally go up, and the probability of offering an opportunity to an adversary that we were perceiving to be weak, we were being perceived to be weak, or that we lacked the will to support a large, capable, competent military with both capability technologically and capacity, those would be signals that we wouldn't want to send. So I think risk would go up.
Okay, thank you. And for Secretary Wilson or General Goldfein, it's my great honor to represent the airmen of the Air Force Space Command in Colorado Springs. We're talking a lot these days about the imminence of the threat that our near-peer adversaries pose to our space assets. What benefits would a space-focused either combatant command or a space corps provide for your space warfighters?
Congressman, we are the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they're seeking to develop the capability to deny us the use of space in crisis or in war. In fiscal year 19, the Congress supported a change in about $5 billion in our defense, in our space budget, and an addition of $7 billion over the FYDP. This year's FY20 budget also represents a significant increase in space spending in FY20 and beyond, because it's shifting from a benign to a contested environment. The forces that we have in Colorado, as you well know, are operating some of our most important space assets, and they are exceptional airmen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Milley and General Goldfein. General Neller, Commandant of the Marine Corps, recently raised the alarm that he was experiencing severe and dangerous deficiencies in the Marine Corps due to unplanned demands placed on the armed forces. On March 22nd, I sent a letter to each of you and to Admiral Richardson asking whether your services also had the same readiness issues associated with unfunded mandates, including the Southwest border operations. Do you have an update on when you will each respond to my letter?
Acknowledge receipt of the letter, got it, I think it was last week. We are going to respond to the Army staff's working through it, and we'll get it over to you shortly. Specifically, though, the Army and the Marines are fundamentally different in terms of size and scale and scope. So what General Neller wrote, he's representing the Marine Corps and stands alone and let it stand on its own merit.
I understand, General. I'll go
that is
deeper
not
into
the position of the Army.
I'll go deeper into questions on that later. Thank you, though. General?
Sure, we'll get that back to you right away. And the only thing I would tell you is that probably the largest unfunded mandate that we're facing right now is we're cash flowing Tyndall recovery and Offutt recovery.
Excellent, thank you. General Neller listed serious problems with current funding mandates. He said the Marines were working in structures compromised by natural disasters, that exercises and engagements with allies around the world had to be canceled, and that the Corps would have to stop hurricane work in May. Are airmen or soldiers also working under these same set of dire circumstances as their Marine Corps counterparts? Understanding, obviously, that I understand the difference between Marine Corps, Army, and Air Force. General Milley?
That is not the same for the Army, no.
Sir, there is a similarity with the Air Force in that the Marine Corps was hammered by a storm at Camp Lejeune. We were hammered at Tyndall and at Offutt. Last week, I had to stop 61 facility projects in 18 states. If we get to the 1st of May and we still don't have any help, we're going to have to put a pause on Tyndall recovery, or it'll affect flight operations, and we will have people there who will have to continue to work in degraded facilities. And then the decisions that I'll have to make in May, and then my successor in July and September will be similarly difficult.
Jim?
Sure, same.
Great. Have you spoken to Acting Secretary Shanahan about these readiness issues that you just brought up, Secretary Wilson or General Goldfein, about the readiness problems and issues meeting your requirements, specifically in terms of natural disaster recovery?
Yes.
Okay. Have either of you spoken to President Trump about his desire for a wall at the southern border outweighing your service funding requirements? General Milley?
I have not personally talked to President Trump about that, no.
Secretary Wilson?
No.
No.
Great. Secretary Esper and Secretary Wilson, have you spoken to Secretary Spencer about General Neller's concern whether they reflected at all in your services? I know this is kind of redundant, but want to make sure we're covering all bases.
No, I don't believe we have.
No, I don't believe I have.
How can we be confident the money that we authorize or that appropriators send to the department to meet shortfalls won't be reprogrammed into the future to something that doesn't help the readiness issues that we have been discussing for other issues or for other programs such as a wall on the southern border going into the future?
Sir, in the case of the Air Force, it has to do with recovering from the storm and the need for the supplemental.
Right, I understand, but politically speaking, what confidence do I have going to the future that more money, as said, won't end up at some other project, whether it's a border or something else into the future?
Senator, we're trying to work with you on the
promotion.
supplemental. I'm not sure how to answer your question.
Okay. I'm sure you've already heard many members of Congress on both sides just say that because of this situation, because what President Trump is forcing us, or is what is occurring, it really creates a lot of confidence problems about how we fund our military and whether we have to be stricter into the future in terms of flexibility, which I think also at the end is a detriment. And I guess it's not really appropriate for you to comment one or the other, but I think I just want to reiterate what many of my other colleagues, both on the right and the left side of me, have said in regards to how disturbed we are that money is going to be taken without legislative approval for projects from the military, which we have clearly designated as important priorities to us. But with that, I yield back my time.
Sorry, Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all my colleagues' interest today in MILCON projects at Fort Drum. Because of this interest, I expect that you each who have referenced it will partner as we fund this railhead in the MILCON appropriations bill. But let me state for the record regarding the border security questions, the House Appropriations Committee released a list of vulnerable projects, and that does not include Fort Drum. I think that's important to note for the record. Moving on to my question, Secretary Esper and General Milley, with the stand-up of Army Futures Command, can you explain how the new command is interfacing with academia, industry, and the greater S&T enterprise? I know the Army has prioritized advanced prototyping within the RDT&E budget for FY20. Can you expand upon this decision and how you plan to also maintain support for basic research? Secretary Esper.
Sure, Congressman. I think the first part was our selection of Austin, Texas as the headquarters of Futures Command. We set it right there in a a city growing, a lot of capability in terms of its research and development. It's embedded in the University of Texas system. And we're not behind walls or barbed wire. We're actually out in the community. We're working with young entrepreneurs and innovators. And we're also reaching out to academia there and in other places. So, for example, a couple months ago, I went to Pittsburgh on a recruiting pitch and spent some time at Carnegie Mellon University, where we opened up the Artificial Intelligence Task Force. And as we did that, there were 2 dozen companies and other institutions of higher learning there. So we're trying to involve all parties in this to make sure that we do that. And critical to that is sustained predictable funding for S&T. That's what, and now we've aligned 80% of that to our 6 modernization priorities. So we're making sure we get good ROI on those each dollar we invest.
General Milley, did you want to add to that?
AFC has got tentacles throughout the entire nation, centered in the great state of Texas, as previously mentioned, but tentacles throughout, academic and S&T and R&D throughout the entire nation. So,
thank you. I'll yield the balance of my time to Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Representative Stefanik, and thank you all, particularly to your families who bear the brunt of all of our service. So thank you. And Secretary Esper, I just also wanted to, and General Milley, to commend the Army on the Futures Command. I started on the M1 tank, which hasn't been modernized in 40 years, and that entire vehicle. But taking a step back, I think the defense strategy is right to shift back to great power competition, but we also can't forget the wars that we're in. We have to be prepared for future years, but we have to be also still focused on the 60 to 70 countries right now as we speak, where we have special operators and other folks deployed that need our support. So shifting over to General Goldfein and to Secretary Wilson, we all know, we don't need to rehash the issues with the A-10 over the years, their predecessors, that essentially Congress has forced the Air Force to keep it. Now we have the light attack aircraft that seems to be, procurement seems to be dragging along. And just very quickly, in 1952, your predecessors on both sides, the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary of the Army, agreed to where Army aviation ends, Air Force aviation begins. I wonder, with this kind of seemingly over the years, I don't know, resistance, cultural resistance to the close air support mission, is it time maybe to shift that light attack?
Sir, first let me
over to the Army and have them take that on?
Sir, let me first respectfully push back, if I could.
Sure.
I've been fighting side by side with the United States Army my entire career. I've been on the ground, I've been in the air. There's no resistance, no resistance. And I will tell you, we are going to fly to the sound of the guns, or we're going to die trying. So
I appreciate that, General.
We are committed to close air support.
We cannot let that pendulum swing too far to fly high, fly fast, fly far, while we still are. There's a lot of folks in this town that want to wish those wars away. They're still ongoing. We have dead Green Berets in Niger that had to rely on the French for close air support.
Sir,
we need that capability now, not
I would
years
just
from now.
thank you for the opportunity to state without equivocation that we are and we will always be dedicated to supporting on the ground with close air support. Can I talk for a minute about light attack?
Absolutely.
If I could?
You can talk for 20 seconds about light attack.
I can't give you a better example of how I believe we have aligned ourselves with congressional intent on the authorities you gave us to advance the business of light attack. And if there's a follow-up question where I have time, I'd love to walk you through just what we've accomplished with those authorities.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be back for a follow-on question.
Thank you. Just so you know, we've got votes 1:15-ish, so we're going to press on and get as much as we can before they call votes or until we're done with witnesses. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's critically important that we have an overarching vision for ISR modernization, and that's certainly a joint effort. The TACT Air and Land Subcommittee had a pretty good briefing from both the Air Force and the Army on current capabilities and modernization. The Air Force, I know in open sources, I've read that of the 76 squadrons that you're looking to expand to over the next several years, 22 are C2 ISR squadrons. The COCOM commanders have an unsatiable appetite for intelligence and information. And my concern is that when we are in a contested environment, that the Army may not be putting its best foot forward right now in the modernization effort. And so let me ask this question. And you know, when I look at the 8 cross-functional teams, I don't see ISR in there. And while I know when we go to war, you're going to go as a joint force, there are going to be operations and moments out there where you can't rely on the Air Force for whatever reason, not because they're not unreliable, but because the contest is too great. So that there's going to be an operational and tactical need for ISR capabilities. Where is that in the Army modernization program, and is it reflected in your budget?
So thank you, Mr. Brown, for raising this issue. ISR is critically important, and you've hit the nail on the head. It's how do we adapt our systems or procure future systems to be effective in an environment that is very contested with very capable enemy air defenses and other means. So ISR is part and parcel of several of our cross-functional teams. It's critical. What comes to mind immediately is long-range precision fires in order to do deep targeting. You can look at even the next-generation combat vehicle, which is considering organic drones to do over-the-horizon type of capabilities, and even down to the soldier lethality CFT, where soldiers are backpacking small drones to use at the tactical level. That said, we also have an ISR task force within the Army that works at the organic level, the joint, and the national level to make sure that we're well integrated. And we're pushing hard on this front to make sure that we can do this. I'd be remiss as well, since you were a helicopter pilot, you know, as part of our future vertical lift, we're looking at manned, unmanned teaming, if not fully autonomous, where we can penetrate enemy air defenses and do unmanned with our rotary wing aircraft the ISR we need to help with the ground force maneuver.
So are you contemplating any force structure changes over the next 10 years?
You know, our Futures Command is working this right now as we pull multi-domain operations, our new doctrine forward and develop it. They're actually looking at how do we organize the Army differently if need be, how do our formations change, how does all that happen, and this is part and parcel of that. Chief, I don't know if you...
Yeah, a couple of comments, Congressman. First, we're putting $4.5 billion into ISR in this budget, so it's not like we're not doing it. It didn't make it into the top 6 as a standalone, but it's embedded within, as the Secretary said, it's embedded within almost every one of those, so ISR is a piece of that. Thirdly is armies don't fight wars. We fight as a joint force. So it's important to understand that, as Congressman Wallace, and I know you understand, and everybody else, we fight with the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and we fight as a combined force with our allies. So all of these things are interoperable, and we leverage each other's capabilities. Fingers mentioned the F-35, for example, as being the quarterback of the joint force, and we're leveraging these capabilities from space and the air domain. So there is a significant amount of ISR out there. We recognize it's important. We think we're putting in an appropriate amount of money and investment in ISR in this particular budget, and it's embedded within those priorities.
You know, and I appreciate the joint fight, the joint force effort. I just think that there are going to be times when a COCOM commander is going to be out there, is going to make a request for ISR, and the demands are going to be too great. Currently, they have organic capabilities. They're operating now more in uncontested environments. Are those organic capabilities going to be able to survive and be effective in a contested environment? But it sounds like the answer is you're making the investments. It's in the budget. Let me just use the remaining 20 seconds to say that I am not picking up the A-10 mantle like Representative McSally, but we've got A-10s in the Maryland Air National Guard. I'm concerned that they're programmed to be grabbed and taken by fiscal year 2021, but yet we have not yet heard about the replacement airframe, the C-130J. So for the record, if you could just follow up with my office on the status of the fielding of the C-130J to the Maryland Air National Guard. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. First, I'd like to thank Secretary Wilson for having Undersecretary Matthew Donovan meet with the Arnold Air Force Bases Community Council yesterday at the Pentagon to address their concerns. So we're grateful for that. You know, we can't address the threats laid out in the National Defense Strategy without solid investment in our range and test facilities and the associated testing and evaluation workforce. And I should also note the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation recently released a report highlighting the need to improve U.S. infrastructure to conduct operationally relevant testing of the next generations of weapons. So Secretary Wilson and Secretary Esper, what is your assessment of the U.S. capabilities to fully test hypersonic technology?
Sir, we are actually going to be building some more wind tunnels, hypersonic wind tunnels. I just visited where we're going to be building one in Indiana and then another one at Arnold. And so those are the two places that I'm aware of. Overall, on testing and training ranges, there's a significant investment in the Air Force budget in improving our testing and training ranges.
Okay. And Secretary Esper, I know that you have a fondness for this region of the country because both our wives share the same home county of Franklin, Tennessee, so I'd like to get your input on Arnold and the same question.
Yes, sir. On the Army test ranges, particularly as we look forward with regard to our 6 modernization priorities, where we're pursuing anything from directed energy to hypersonics, other systems, we know that we need to continue to improve our test ranges and our infrastructure. Sensors, for example, come to mind as you test hypersonics. Is how do you make sure you have the means to test them and track them and monitor their performance in flight?
Okay. Second question, what are the services doing to improve and modernize test capabilities within their respective range and test facilities?
I'll just pick up and say, again, I've been to a couple of our test ranges, whether it's Yuma, Arizona, or White Sands Missile Range. We recognize improvements are needed at each, but it goes to all of our others. We need to look at that, and we can come back and give you more detail if you want that.
Okay.
Sir, our test ranges and particularly our training ranges are significantly impacted by the budget, that significant increase. The two that will be most impacted in a positive way are Nellis and J-Park in Alaska. We were going to be trying to bring those to what we call 5th generation capability, and then a number of other improvements in our ranges that are closer to home for many people in the lower 48.
Okay, and then kind of along the same lines, finally, are we adequately addressing the infrastructure and workforce needs to support the testing and evaluation of current and planned weapon systems?
I think is, again, that's part and parcel of what we're looking at to make sure we improve. It's a combination of things. It's infrastructure, it's sensors, it may well be people as well, but all those things we're looking at because we need to make sure we're postured to do the testing we will need to do in the coming years as we move forward on prototyping new systems and then certainly down selecting and operationally testing them.
So I think we're okay on testing. I would say that on our ranges, some of the things that are most expensive and difficult to get are the simulated enemy things, and we are adding in more what we call red air or contract red air to be able to imitate bad guys and fly against us.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Houlihan will be next.
Thank you so much for all of your time. I have two very brief questions, and one of them has to do with, on the very 70, 80 days that I've been in Congress, one thing that I've learned about my job here is to make sure that we deliver a budget on time so that you guys can be responsive to that budget and know what to plan for. And so I share the responsibility that with Congress to make sure that that happens. But I also have learned a little bit about the your responsibility as well on your side of the table to make sure that you provide clear priorities for us. And so I represent the state of Pennsylvania, and one of the things that's been striking to me is that in the most recent round of budgeting, there's been a reduction or no longer an ask for the Chinook upgrades for armored multi-purpose vehicle upgrades and Bradley upgrades. And all of those things were, as of 18 months ago, in the prioritization of the budget, and I think have caused a lot of consternation in the Pennsylvania supply chain, I can tell you. And so my question to you is, what changed, over the last 18 months, I guess Secretary Esper in general, that would have made you change your minds about the importance of these upgrades?
Congresswoman, I'll go first. I would say a few things. First of all, clear guidance from Secretary Mattis at the time with regard to our direction, followed up by the National Defense Strategy, which said shift from 18, 19 years of counterinsurgency warfare to high-intensity conflict. And that caused us to relook everything we did. We also rolled out a modernization strategy, I think, in May of last year, and then topped it off with the Army vision that I introduced at the beginning of this hearing. So the pivot toward being able to fight and win against near-peer competitors caused us to relook everything and fundamentally shift the direction with regard to how we train, how we man, and how we equip the force, and soon how we organize as well based on new doctrine. So 5 major lines of effort there that are driving all this and pulling us into the direction of those modernization priorities that you're referring to.
Mm-hmm. Sir?
Well, same thing, Congressman. When the NDS was published by then Secretary Mattis, that represents a fundamental shift, and it's authoritative. It's orders to us that we have to go back and do the analysis, and we have to make the appropriate shifts. If we do not shift, if we continue to produce legacy systems, then we're going to really put at risk, significant risk, very, very high risk, the first battle of the next war, where soldiers that are probably yet unborn will be fighting with equipment that we see today. And that will not be a good thing, as you well know from your own service. So we've made a conscious, very, very difficult decision to shift gears and start laying the groundwork to fund the modernization of the United States Army.
And I really understand that hard decisions need to be made. And I guess one of my questions to you is, was there any consideration in making these hard decisions about the impact on the supply chain or the industrial base in those
Absolutely.
decisions?
That was discussed at great length, extraordinary pain, led by Secretary Esper and the whole Army staff, civilian and military, in massive amounts of hours. I can't even describe the level of pain that was throughout all that discussion. Absolutely, yes.
I would add as well, we had a number of conversations with the private sector, particularly with CEOs and senior leaders from, I think, some of the companies you're referring to. We could only be as transparent as we could with regard to particular cuts, but we were very clear with regard to where we're going, those 6 modernization priorities. And as I and the chief, other senior leaders have messaged for well over a year, that's where we're going. There's predictability. Those priorities are not changing, and that's where we're shifting $30 billion into the future. So meet us there. Come talk to us about how you can be a player in that future, because whoever gets on that bus will have a franchise or work or whatever you want to call it for decades to come after that, because that's our new direction.
Thank you, and I look forward to those continued conversations on that. I only have about a minute left, and so I'll try and truncate my question, which is, what are we doing? I was a lieutenant in the Air Force, engineer, and I looked up and didn't really understand in the late 80s, early 90s what my career path looked like because of the change in threat. My question is, what are we doing in this area of cyber to make sure that a young lieutenant such as me would look up and understand where they could head in a career in the military?
Congresswoman, over the next couple of months, we've been working for about 18 months looking at how do we evaluate, how do we promote officers and develop officers for the future of combat. And probably by this summer, we will be rolling out new categories, including separate categories for different kinds of officers, about 7 different subcategories, so that a cyber officer doesn't have the same things to do in their career as a maintenance officer, and they don't compare to each other, because we need to promote to the needs of the service and not just promote everybody like their line in the Air Force.
Thank you so much for your time. I yield back.
Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by joining my colleagues in thanking Secretary Wilson for his service. You are well thought of throughout the Air Force, but particularly in my community where we have a number of Air Force assets. I'm grateful for all the time you've spent with the amazing service members in Northwest Florida. My questions springboard off of Dr. Desjardins' questions about test and evaluation. Right now we have a problem in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It's that people want to drill there for oil, and it's where the Air Force tests experimental missiles, among many other things. And I am not a practitioner, but I would expect that testing experimental missiles over oil rigs is probably a bad idea. There is currently a moratorium in place that protects the Air Force and the military mission that is set to expire in the year 2022. General Goldfein, on the 23rd of June in 2017, you wrote Chairman Bishop a letter. You copied then Chairman Thornberry and myself on that letter, and in part you stated, the moratorium that protects the Air Force is essential for developing and sustaining the Air Force's future combat capabilities. The Air Force needs the certainty of the proposed extension to guarantee long-term capabilities for future tests. Emerging technologies such as hypersonics, fifth-generation fighters, advanced subsurface systems will require enlarged testing and training footprints and increased Air Force reliance on the moratorium far beyond 2022. General Goldfein, has anything changed regarding the Air Force's position since you sent this information to then Chairman Bishop, then Chairman Thornberry, and myself?
No, sir.
And, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
And I would ask General Goldfein, you know, right now, candidly, the bargaining going on is to trade away space in the Gulf test range for oil companies in exchange for an extended period of time that you say is essential for the Air Force's planning. If we had a Gulf test range that got smaller rather than larger, what impact would that have on the types of things that we need to test and evaluate given the current national defense strategy?
As we build longer range capabilities, it's going to require longer range testing. It's as simple as that. And it's going to have a devastating impact as we really build, as we work into directed energy, as we work into hypersonics, and as we work into long-range capability to make sure we stay ahead of the adversary. We cannot afford to have our ranges get smaller. They have to get bigger.
And Secretary Wilson, do you have any basis to disagree with General Goldfein as to the need for a Gulf test range that is not getting smaller but getting larger?
No, and in fact, the number one reason that we need to rebuild Tyndall is because of its immediate access to the Gulf test range without going over any population area.
Well, thank you. Well, Mr. Chairman, I know you appreciate brevity, but I would just state for the record that this is an issue where there is an unequivocal position of the Air Force that they need this, and during the 115th Congress, the special interests who wanted to explore energy won. And we couldn't get these protections into the NDAA. And so I'm hopeful that with the new majority in control, that we would listen to the military officials and that we would consider the request that General Goldfein made in 2017 to consider these changes and to consider an extension in the NDAA.
I would be very open to that request. And just so the gentleman knows, you can have your 5 minutes. I'm not going to rush you on the 5 minutes. It's just when we go over 5 minutes. So
yes, well,
and you always do a great job of going less than that. So I appreciate that.
Seeking to earn extra credit in protection of the Gulf test range, I'll yield back my remaining 90 seconds.
It's time off in purgatory. I appreciate that. But we will absolutely work on that issue. It's very important. I appreciate you raising it. Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, and thank you, Secretary Wilson. It's been an honor to get to know you over these first several months of Congress. I am sorry to hear you are headed to Texas instead of the great state of New Jersey. We will miss you, but thank you for your service. Secretary Esper, as you know, Picatinny Arsenal in my district has an outstanding record in designing, developing, producing, and delivering world-class lethality for all of our DoD components. They are responsible for delivering 90% of the DoD's lethality and for the implementation of acquisition, streamlining, and cost-saving initiatives that are modeled for how we should be executing all of our acquisition programs. I'm aware of several ongoing efforts to analyze roles and responsibilities of various Army organizations, and given that the workforce at Picatinny is a highly trained and skilled acquisition organization, I'm curious, because we know that ammunition is in continuous production. It gets produced and then it's either used in training or set aside for times of conflict, so there's no transition to sustainment for ammunition like there would be in, say, a tank or a helicopter. So the life cycle management of those programs should be done by acquisition experts. And I'm curious, can you give us some sense of and some detail on the McKinsey studies entitled Transition to Sustainment, or Roles and Responsibilities? What is the exact topic of those studies? When will each be completed? And when can I and other members of this committee receive the findings of these studies?
So thank you for that question, Congresswoman. Picatinny is a great place. I was there last year, enjoyed really spending time there with the workforce. They're wonderful, and got briefed on a number of things that they are developing, to include technologies that are critical to our 6 modernization priorities. So I had a spectacular visit there. The Army is reviewing a number of reform proposals. I think what we call the Army Reform Initiative currently contains about 750 different proposals or so that came up from the ranks, from the field, from the commands, and we're working our way through those. That in conjunction with Night Court, which remains underway, we continue to look for reforms so we can shift money appropriately. There is a look at ammunition sustainment, particularly when you get into the purchasing piece of it. I'm not current on where that stands, but that's being looked at between our acquisition folks and our Army Material Command jointly together to make sure that we, again, put it in the right place appropriate to ensure we sustain the force and the readiness of the force. And again, it's another reform initiative to make sure we get maximize efficiency in the service.
Would you mind getting back to me just on exactly where you're at with that?
Sure.
That process?
Yeah, will do.
Thank you. And the National Defense Strategy also calls for our ground forces to reform and prepare to face near-peer adversaries. How are we going to ensure that the ongoing research into long-range ammunition, mortars, and other projectiles has a path to transition to procurement against all the other competing budget priorities so we're not outgunned in future conflicts?
Well, I'll take the first stab. I'm sure the Chief has some input here as well, but obviously we spent a lot of time and money over the past couple of years, for example, building up our munitions to ensure we were ready. And we'll just leave it at that for now. But we are looking ahead. I mean, there are some incredible capabilities, the extended range cannon artillery, for example, which will give us 70 kilometers plus range, which will allow us to outrange Russian counterparts. It's not just about the gun in that case, but it's about the round. And I believe I actually saw a prototype of the round out of Picatinny. So it's developments like that. It's as well as the new cased ammunition for the next generation squad weapon also had a chance to witness a demonstration there at Picatinny. So I think Picatinny's on the leading edge of a number of things we're doing when it comes to ammunition. And ammunition's critical if we're going to get the ranges we need to fight and win future conflicts.
Thank you very much. General, did you have anything to add?
No, I think the Secretary said it all, ma'am.
Thank you. And then one final question. Secretary Wilson, was there a comparison of the cost of performing a SLEP or service life extension on the F-15C versus owning and operating the planned fleet of the F-15X, the new aircraft?
There was an analysis of that, and the airframe just really isn't going to make it. And so the most cost-effective option was to buy off the end of the line the F-15EX.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walls.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Goldfein, we'll pick up that conversation on light attack. And I do want to be very clear. I am not, and I don't know that of anyone that is doubting the Air Force's march to the guns. I would not be here. I would be dead without the A-10, without the AC-130, without those close air support assets. What I'm talking about is capability. I'd also be a rich man if I had $1 for every time I called up for close air support and the assets were up getting gas. They didn't have the loiter time that we needed, and particularly in remote locations all over Africa and other places where we need it. So I guess my point, and I'd appreciate to be able to talk to your team for the record, my point is that capability was needed years ago. It's needed now. With all of the shift to near peer and a lot of that conversation, I fear the pendulum's swinging too far and that we're still in the fight. As much as many people in this town would wish it away. So I just appreciate, for the record, a discussion, a better discussion on when we're going to get those capabilities, particularly our special operators. Switching to space, I believe the Space Corps is the right way to go. Thank you for the hard work and the proposal there. I really think that we're sitting in a point in history. The Air Force shifted away from the Army Air Corps in 1947. They needed unique capabilities and people, and I think we're seeing that same shift now with space, with that new warfighting domain. On some of your programs, particularly your launch programs, I did want to ask Secretary Wilson, obviously we need to retain our assured access to space. What are you seeing as the risk and benefits of the Air Force's strategy of selecting its two service providers, I understand, for launch? For the 5-year contract, we just had an award, my understanding, on RDT&E side for upgrading the launch vehicles to be able to handle the military payloads. So that was just awarded, but before that research is done, we're going to have another award in terms of launch going forward for the next 5 years. How do you rationalize those two, and where do you see that going?
Let me give you a couple of things on launch. First, we've had a 24% decline in unit cost of launch since 2012, and it's because of a competitive environment and advances in research and development. And we're 76 for 76 on the reliability of our launches. The guidance that we were working on, and it comes from the Congress, is to end our reliance on the Russian RD-180 engine by 2022, and we are on track to do that. The real challenge is in our most difficult area, the heavy lift area, which is where this request for proposal that we expect to issue in April is going to address. The idea is a request for proposal in April for a 2020 decision in order to get off the RD-180 Russian engines by 2022. So the timeline is set by the congressional mandate and by our joint desire to not be reliant on Russian engines.
Thank you. One last question, shifting over to you, General Milley. There's just a lot of buzz, take it for what you will, in the Special Forces community about a drop in standards for our Green Berets getting through that pipeline, long and difficult pipeline, some would argue too long. That's to meet the demand that's being placed on our force. 18 years in and counting. I think we're in a generational war. The capacity building efforts, I commend what you've done on the SFAB. Have you looked into that, into this issue, allegations of investigations down at Fort Bragg and retribution on cadre that are trying to raise these issues? And if you've looked at it, what do you make of it?
We have, and I say we, as you know, United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, has Title X responsibility for all U.S. Special Operations Forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And Tony, under Tony Thomas's leadership, and Fran Beaudet, who's the commander of U.S. Army Special Operations Command, both of them have looked at those allegations in depth, and I've looked at it as a Special Forces veteran as well. So basic conclusions are, yeah, there's been some modification of changes, but not to lower standards, to meet standards of an evolving world and evolving demand. So I don't think that the special operations standards in the Q course, as far as I know, I don't think they've been lowered for any particular reason. And that's what I'm getting out of
I'm sorry.
Lots of people. I'm sorry.
General Amendment's time has expired.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And I certainly take your point. I think it's a crucial issue, but it is good to know that they're maintaining the high standards. So, Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here and for your service to our country. To Secretary Esper and General Milley, thank you so much for all the time that you took with us recently, with me in particular, to talk about this budget and to answer and address the questions that I had. Secretary Wilson, good to see you again, and I want to thank you for the multiple conversations that we've had as you transition to El Paso and the great University of Texas at El Paso, and to hear me out as I bring forward concerns by the community and talk about the opportunities that lie ahead. Secretary Esper, in reading over the budget and the memos about the budget, the fiscal year 2020 budget request for military construction, family housing, and BRAC is an increase of over 387%, and it includes, please correct me if I'm wrong, a backfilling of the funding that was taken by the emergency declaration for the wall?
So, Congresswoman, I think you're referring to, I think it is $3.6 billion that was inserted into the Army budget by the Office of Secretary of Defense as a placeholder, if you will, along with another $3 billion or so for other emergency-type actions, and then I think a couple billion for the bases that were destroyed by hurricanes.
I just want to go on the record about how deeply concerning it is to me to know that funding was taken, and we've heard from a couple of other members here today about our ability to trust that money that we've appropriated won't be moved for purposes that were not intended by this committee or by the Congress. And so just want to state publicly how troubling that is to me. And it concerns me, especially in light of what we discussed at our classified hearing, Secretary Wilson, about the challenges that the Army faces ahead and the money that's being cash flowed in order to try to cover some of those challenges. So just want to express my concern. I'm also concerned about the fact that in this budget there appears to be a $200 million decrease in family housing. Is that correct?
I'd have to check on that. I don't believe so. We're actually investing substantial sums of money for Milcon and what we call FSRM, which is sustainment and renovation, to get our Army family housing up to Q1 and Q2 levels at a much quicker time than what it was before. And I think we are now exceeding the OSD standards. So I'd have to come back, and maybe it's sometimes what happens is what we propose. For example, last year, Congress adds additional money, and then we come up with more money over the proposal, but it looks like less because Congress inserted additional money. So let us do the forensics and come back to you as to how you're reading that.
I appreciate that. I see that there's an increase in the remediation component, but this was brought to my attention during a recent Veterans Town Hall meeting that I had in El Paso about the military housing for families, and so I would like to understand that more.
Sure.
And one of the things that we learned at one of the other briefings, at least from my perspective, I think it's going to require a significant amount of investment to not just remediate, but I think in a lot of cases probably rebuild.
Right.
So I look forward to a continued conversation on that.
Some of it is as well. The Army, most of the Army housing is privatized, so a lot of that all that funding comes out of what's been capitalized by the private partners. And Chief, did you want to add something there?
Well, we can get you the actual forensics, Congressman, but I'm pretty sure that some of that $200 million, or a good part of it, is due to some completion of overseas projects in our OCONUS bases. But we'll get you the actual numbers.
I appreciate it. As I mentioned, this was something important to some constituents at home, so would like to learn more. Secretary Wilson, so again, congratulations on the nomination. I want to ask you about something, a trend that has been disturbing to me on sexual assault and the Air Force. It remains a serious problem throughout the military, but these trends in our service academies are really of great concern. This February, reports surfaced that nearly half of female cadets in the Air Force Academy experienced sexual harassment during the 2017-18 academic year. Another 15% reported unwanted sexual contact. Could you tell me what the Air Force has done to address that?
And I apologize. This is a very, very complicated question to hit you with 3 seconds to go in the time. So we're going to have you submit an answer for that for the record, because I know the Air Force has worked on a great many different issues. So please get back to Ms. Escobar with the detailed explanation. It's not something you can do in 10 seconds, I don't think.
Yes, sir.
So, and with that, the gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank all of our witnesses here today for sharing us with your expert positions and opinions. I have a couple points for questions. I want to, first of all, just congratulate Secretary Wilson for a job well done. And we have great universities, too, in Omaha for just future reference. Secondly, on the issue of the F-15, this was an issue forced on the Air Force over a decade ago. There was a desire for doubling the number of F-22s, and that decision was made outside of the Air Force to stop that production. Now we're left with a gap today that we have to fill. So I understand the predicament that you all are in. And thirdly, when it comes to the reprogramming, I don't think it's optimal either. I don't think this is the way we should have gone forward. But Congress had the opportunity to work with the president, find a compromise for border funding, and it did not. It went backwards from their original position. And now today we are left with a crisis with 800 to 900,000 pace coming here illegally, being caught at the border and being swamping our DHS, our Border Patrol. Even Jay Johnson, the Secretary of the DHS under Obama, President Obama, said we have a crisis. So this is something we can't ignore. So anyway, I appreciate your points on that earlier in the hearings. My first question is to General Milley. My understanding is our tank modernization, our infantry fighting vehicle, our MRS, is behind what China and Russia is doing. We have some plans for the infantry fighting vehicle and the MRS, but should we be concerned that we have this gap, that it appears to me that we're outgunned, outranged right now in these areas, and are we doing everything we can to close that gap? Do I have that right?
We are doing everything we can to close the gap. In terms of outgunned and outranged, typically what people mean by that is outgunned is your adversary will have more of that type of, more capacity than you do. In the case of Europe, yes, the Russians could mass more armor than the United States at a point of crisis, perhaps that's possible. If you add up all of NATO, though, you get a different number. So the outgun piece, you got to be careful, and you got to kind of do the math, and it can be interesting. With China, same thing. So as far as outrange goes, the tanks of the world, all of them, German, American, Chinese, Russian, et cetera, pick your tank, they're all within reasonable ranges and capabilities of each other. The Russian tank has a missile attached to it. Ours does not, so they have extended range, et cetera. But I am very confident that the weapons platforms are within acceptable degrees of risk of each other. The real difference on any tank or any aircraft or anything is the training of the crew. It's the people. It's the skill of the operator. And I would match our skill against anyone.
Thank you. I want to thank Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein for visiting Offutt. Secretary Wilson, could you tell us what will be the impact if we do not get Tyndall and Offutt in the supplemental? You're doing cash flow right now, as you said. What is the impact if we don't get this done in a timely manner?
Sir, we have already had to hold back money for 61 facilities projects in 18 states. On the 1st of May, if we don't start to have funding flow, we're going to have to put the Tyndall recovery on hold. By the middle of May, we're going to have to stop some aircraft repairs, ground some bombers. Maintenance backlog is going to start to increase because we're going to have to cash flow this, and if we don't have a supplemental, we have to take it out of this year's budget. And then at some point, probably sometime in the middle of the summer, we'll have to defer the Offutt recovery.
Thank you. And General Goldfein, considering Compass Call and our electronic warfare capabilities, we've always tried to push for 2 replacement aircraft a year. And I know this year we were requesting 1 of the Air Forces. I just think it's hard on a squadron to have 1 Gulfstream, 1 EC-130. Could you just explain the problems here, and would you optimally want 2 a year, or just if you give us a little background, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, the challenge we have, Congressman, on this one is that we've got to take the aircraft, we've got to take the equipment from the C-130 and place it on the E-37. So and we got to do this while we're meeting combatant commander requirements. Right. So limiting ourselves is based on the fact that we've got to maintain C-130s at the same time we bring on the new aircraft and make that transition. And so while we would like to do it faster, what we built was a capability of doing it, essentially build the airplane while it's flying.
Concerning the RC-135s, I heard from the Half A2 that there's no plans to defund the RCs in the future, that it's the weapon of choice for the decades to come. Is that your understanding?
It is, but the same work that we're doing in advanced battle management system as we look at what the replacement for Joint Stars is going to be, we're looking at all of these capabilities. Right. The ones that right now are more platform-centric, to how do we look at all of the sensors that we have and all of the domains and all of the services and use that as our asymmetric advantage as we fuse that information to greater fidelity and better decision-making.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just a couple quick comments. One thing that has come up that I don't think this committee has focused on, I know Mr. Scott mentioned this, we need a supplemental. I appreciate your comment on that, the impact that's had on the military, but also it's had devastating impact on a large number of communities across the country. We need to work through and get a deal on that. On the border wall, I don't disagree that there is, without question, a huge problem at the border right now. The problem that we have is that a wall is no solution to any of that. So with all the problems that we have down there, to take, $5, $6, $10, $20 billion, whatever it is, to build a vanity wall, that does not solve the problem. The problem is we got people pouring up here from south of the border, and I think a thoughtful policy, certainly things have not gotten better since the Trump administration has implemented whatever immigration policies they've wanted to implement. It's gotten worse. And then to say we're going to cut off the funding from Central America, when I think the one country where things have gotten better is El Salvador, where USAID has been down there helping so that people don't have to flee. Yeah, we got big problems at the border. The solutions coming out of the White House are making it worse, not better. And I darn sure don't want to take $6, $7, $8 billion out of DOD to build some wall that isn't going to make the situation any better. So we definitely have to work on that. We're not saying there's not a problem. This is not the solution, and we don't want the money taken out of DOD. So happy to work with you on that. Ms. Holland?
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. Secretary Wilson, as you are well aware, the fuel spill on Kirtland Air Force Base resulted in up to 24 million gallons of jet fuel, leaving dangerous toxins and contaminants in our ground soil that pose a threat to Albuquerque's clean drinking water. I've heard from many of my constituents that the Air Force is not clearly communicating its efforts to remediate the spread of those dangerous contaminants. And there's a discrepancy between the progress the Air Force claims and what has been asserted by community stakeholders. So my question is, or my questions, community stakeholders have repeatedly expressed that the Air Force has either refused to take their input or refused to share information about the cleanup, leading them to believe that environmental restoration at Kirtland is no longer a priority. Any budget priorities must include a responsibility for this and other contamination that the Air Force has caused in New Mexico. And it's happened at other places too, as I'm sure you know. Can you tell us whether the Air Force remains committed to the environmental restoration efforts at Kirtland and elsewhere, and protecting the drinking water upon which thousands of Albuquerque citizens rely? And what are you doing to gain back the public trust on that issue?
Congresswoman, we are committed to the Kirtland project. It's a pump and treat project largely, which will continue over a long period of time.
Thank you. And of course, as I mentioned, the community stakeholders have a different idea of what how that progress is going. And I'm hoping that you will, or someone will, contact them and leave the door open so that they can have some assurance that what they believe and what the Air Force is doing are not two different things.
Happy to work with you on that.
Thank you. When are you leaving?
The end of May.
Okay, we might have time then. Thank you. My second issue is military housing, and it's already been mentioned by a few of my colleagues, but I wanted to see if we could if I could get my issues out, they're go a little bit deeper, more detailed. But military families have met with House and Senate members regarding the harrowing impacts that poor military housing conditions have wreaked on their health and safety. These dire conditions range from mold to vermin to lead to roofs and floors caving in. I grew up in a military family and lived in military housing all of my young life. The housing was always a direct reflection of the discipline that my dad's Marine Corps career demanded. And it doesn't seem like it's that way any longer. I know firsthand that service members like my dad have the highest degree of readiness when they know their family's basic needs are being met. So the services have announced a number of measures to address these issues going forward, but sadly, many families are already suffering the financial hardship from unexpected moves, uncontestable security deposit withholdings, repair and medical bills that they don't get reimbursed for, severe health problems, lead poisoning, respiratory issues from black mold. And so it appears that your budget priorities must include that. I know that it looks like there's a $200 million decrease in the Army's family housing budget and just a modest increase in the Air Force's. What are the services doing to support those families who have experienced the impacts from these poor housing conditions?
Congresswoman, we've instituted a couple dozen initiatives. We provide updates to the committee. I'm sure we can get that to you as well if you haven't seen those. But it runs the gamut of everything you said. I mean, we've completed 100% inspections of all of our homes. We've had town halls. We are negotiating or actually discussing with the CEOs changes to all those policies you talked about, non-refundable policies. We're upstaffing at the Army with regard to our garrisons to ensure that there's 100% quality assurance, quality control whenever there's a handover of quarters. I mean, there are just a couple dozen things we're doing to make sure we take care of our families because they are number one. And this is, this has been an eye-opener for everybody. And the Army, the leadership is getting back involved in the housing business, and that's our number one commitment.
Okay,
Thank you.
That's good.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I was tardy because I was on the floor of the House of Representatives speaking on the need for disaster relief. And I just want to make sure that you're all aware that both bills failed in the Senate yesterday evening. Both bills failed. The Republican bill failed 44 to 49, and the Democratic bill failed 46 to 48. Obviously, there's partisan politics going on right now. If the disasters had hit New York or Vermont, I have no doubt that they would have, assistance would have already been provided. But I do have a question, Secretary Wilson. Has the administration submitted a request for disaster assistance for a disaster supplemental?
The money is actually attached to the FY20's budget, so that it is in there with an emergency clause, and it clarifies the amount.
My understanding, though, is that OMB has not actually requested a supplemental package. I mean, obviously, we need a supplemental to pass within the next 8 days. And just so you understand where the calendar is, 8 days from now, we leave for Easter break, and we do not return until April 30th. Now, I'm fine if we don't leave for Easter break until we get a disaster bill done, but I would suggest to you, as someone who's been fighting since October to get a disaster bill done, that we need help. We need help making sure people understand the damage that is going to be done if we don't get a bill passed. And I don't think most of the members of Congress recognize the damage that's going to be done to the Air Force and our military readiness, much less the public. And it's embarrassing to ask you this, but some of you are going to have to get on the news and talk about, and when I say get on the news, it's got to happen now. We have 8 days until we leave until April 30th. And I'm just asking for your help, asking for the president to turn it up. This is ridiculous. Obviously, there's partisan politics going on over there, but the truth of the matter is the president could have done more to help with this before now, too. And I'm asking you for help.
Congressman, you will have every ounce of help that I can provide you, including, I've been talking publicly about this. It's sometimes hard to break through, but this has been a priority for the Air Force since October, and we've talked about it, worked together on it, and we will do everything we can.
But I have seen no stories on this in the mainstream media, none whatsoever, about what the implications of no disaster bill, Congress taking a 2-week or a 3-week break between now and April 30th, if this doesn't get done. And from the standpoint of time, we have tomorrow, in which case we've got a major event on the House floor, which is going to take up a lot of time. Then there's a flyout. So of the 8 days left, 5 are legislative, 3 of the 5 are fly-in and fly-out days where the time is going to be very limited. And you've done a good job of making the point to the choir that this needs to be done. The House has passed 2 bills. The House has passed 2 bills. The Senate is yet to pass a bill. And I would just ask that as you leave here, we need people on the news making sure that Congress does not leave for Easter break until a disaster assistance bill is done. And I will tell you, I think there is very little chance that a bill is done before we leave for Easter break. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time, and maybe somebody's got some good news.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate you emphasizing that issue. It is unbelievably important. Ms. Lauria.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I'd like to start with General Goldfein. In your statement, you said that the Air Force need is 386 operational squadrons. Also, in your statement, you compared this to the height of the Cold War. Previously, you mentioned that was, at the start of Desert Storm, that you had 401 operational squadrons. I'm trying to compare the 2 time frames, the advancement in technology and lethality of weapons and weapon systems and aircraft that we have, and just trying to understand how we are trying to go back to something so close to our Cold War height. with all of the advances being made in our weapons systems? Have we not
Thanks.
gained any efficiencies?
No, thanks, ma'am. And I would characterize it as not at all going back, but absolutely going forward. So here's what we did to answer the Congress's question of what Air Force do you need to successfully execute the National Defense Strategy with moderate risk. We started off with the fully burdened campaign plans, the global campaign plans for both the China and the Russia plan. And I say fully burdened because it won't be just the EUCOM commander that will be supported with joint capabilities. It will be the EUCOM commander, the STRATCOM commander, the NORTHCOM commander. All commanders are going to need forces. So we took the fully burdened global campaigns, and then we look at the assessment of the threat, again, the best threat, and then we ran 2,000 iterations, computer simulations of different force elements and force structures to find the optimum force that we need to be able to execute the strategy. That's what we've laid forward.
So I appreciate the amount of data and analysis that went into that. I was just, for comparison's sake and the amount it costs to invest in each of these squadrons and each aircraft, which is increasingly more expensive, I was just trying to get at, really, is there no more efficiency because we've increased lethality and we've increased capability of aircraft over time?
Actually, there is, ma'am, built into it. And that, remember, 401 to defeat a rogue nation that's non-nuclear, 386 to defeat a China or a Russia nuclear peer.
Okay. And so, just comparing it to the, Navy's analysis where they come up with, something about half of their Cold War peak number that they're saying that they need in ships now, I'd really like just an opportunity separate from this forum, because we don't have time to understand the analysis that you put into to creating that number. And I'll shift now. What percentage of global combatant commander demand for strike aircraft did you meet last year?
Say that again, ma'am. I'm sorry.
What percentage of combatant commander demand did you meet worldwide last year, both for strike aircraft and for tanker aircraft? I've asked this of the Navy relative to carriers, so I'm interested for the Air Force.
Yeah, so when we did our analysis, interestingly enough, not surprising, long-range aviation was the most demand. Tankers, bombers.
Okay, I'm just trying to get for combatant commander demand this year. Do you have those numbers, or can you get that back to me?
Is the question, are we meeting the combatant commander demand?
I think you're looking at
Yes, what percentage? So I asked each combatant commander about the demand that they had for aircraft carriers, and EUCOM said less than a half, CENTCOM is less than a fifth, and PACOM is getting 70%. So do you have a percentage equivalent for Air Force assets relative to combatant commander demand?
We can get you those details, but it is always a trade, and the chairman, as the global integrator of capability, brings those decisions to the Secretary of Defense.
I understand
that's how we determine
the
that.
GFM process. But and I'll shift to General Milley. The same thing as far as brigade combat teams. Do you have an assessment of what combatant commanders requested this year versus what was provided and where those gaps are?
We're meeting the global combatant command demand on brigade combat teams, and roughly speaking, about 60% of global combatant command demand is for Army forces. So we're meeting it. We're at the margins. We're much less than the 1 to 2 deployment dwell ratios. We're spinning hard. And as you know, the size of the Army has reduced significantly from the peak of the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan, although the number of forces required in Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera, have been reduced as well.
Thank you.
But we're spinning pretty hard.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'll shift to another topic for Secretary Wilson. Are you familiar with the 2014 independent review of the DoD nuclear enterprise?
I'm not sure I would know it by that name, but so I'm not sure I can answer the question accurately.
Okay. Well, my follow-up was that particular review, and I believe that General Goldfein was involved in that process as well, in your position at the time.
The nuclear posture review?
No, the DoD review of the nuclear enterprise. So it reviewed all nuclear assets, including ICBMs, nuclear deterrent, as far as submarines, bombers, our NATO dual-capable aircraft.
Yes, ma'am. I think what you're referring to is nuclear posture review, and yes, we were involved in that.
So I'm not referring to the nuclear posture review, but the assessment that was made in 2014 relative to our nuclear assets. So I'm out of time, but I'll try to follow up with you separately on a question. Thank you.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, you were in Indiana a couple of weeks ago, and we appreciate you visiting AM General. I was happy to read the press accounts of your statements about the need to modernize the Humvee as the Army retains it as the workhorse of the tactical vehicle fleet for the coming decades to come. The Army has requested funding to initiate a non-armored Humvee modernization program in FY20. And I want you to know that my colleagues and I stand ready to support your initiative to modernize the Humvee fleet for the future. So, Secretary Esper, can we also count on your best effort to proceed quickly in this Humvee modernization program?
Congressman, my best effort is to proceed quickly on every modernization program. I'm not as familiar with this one, but we're always trying to move quickly. Speed is essential here. It's a key component of acquisition reform.
Appreciate that very much. Moving on to a different subject. As the Army and the Air Force focus on modernization, one of the major concerns that I have is the competition with our peers in fielding offensive and defensive hypersonic technology. Secretary Wilson, a few weeks ago, you too were in Indiana visiting Purdue University to see some of the strides that they are making in several areas of advanced technology, such as hypersonics. Can you highlight the importance for us of hypersonic technology to the future fight?
Congressman, we think that it's very important to the future fight because it gives us speed and the ability to strike at a standoff range. And it's actually a very good example of where all the three services, but in this case particularly the Army and the Air Force, are working together, where the Army had tested a weapon with Navy funding, where the shell worked better than the one we did, but we had some good rockets. And so we put together a tri-service program to develop a hypersonic weapon, drop it and test it off of a B-52, launch it from the ground or launch it from the deck of a ship. And by working together using best technology, we accelerated the advancement of hypersonics by 5 years.
Can you, as well as Secretary Wilson, talk about the role that universities can play in the testing and research of technologies like the advancement of hypersonics?
When we look at the future force, we need to invest in research, development, testing, and evaluation, both at the early stages, but also in developing prototypes and testing them and moving very rapidly. Our adversaries are innovating faster than we are, and we need to figure out where they cannot go and get there faster to create dilemmas for our adversaries.
So as you head off to higher education, you see an important role that universities play in.
Absolutely do, and we're very close to finishing our new science and technology strategy for the Air Force, and it will emphasize partnerships outside of the government laboratories.
Okay, I want to move on to another subject. Secretary Wilson, we have been hearing for quite some time that the Air Force has made a firm decision regarding the future of our strategic bomber force. We're concentrating on the old and the new. The new is the B-21 penetrator, the old is the B-52, a pre-Vietnam era aircraft that has served our nation well, but it is old, and the Air Force has embarked on a commercial engine replacement program. Secretary, the Air Force's FY 2019 budget justification document forecasted FY 2020 funding for this program at $312 million. However, the FY 2020 budget exhibits reflect a funding level of just $175 million for B-52 CERP, or $137 million less. What is your expected timeline to complete this program to ensure our B-52s will be able to continue operating at a critical piece of our strategic plan?
Congressman, I'll have to get back to you on the specific laydown of the funding and give you a detailed answer if I could.
I appreciate that. Are any fundamental changes to the acquisition strategy for this important upgrade to the B-52 fleet? Or are there any?
No, we are modernizing the bombers. We're, of course, buying the B-21, the long-range standoff weapon, and modernizing the intercontinental ballistic missiles. The other part that's not often mentioned in the importance of the nuclear deterrent is nuclear command, control, and communication, and about 3/4 of that is in the Air Force as well.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing some more of those answers for the record. Appreciate your testimony very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for your service. Secretary Wilson will miss you, and so I figured I would start with you. I have significant concerns about our current and future competitiveness with Russia and China, as you know, particularly in space, cyber, and artificial intelligence. I know you've been an advocate for more investment in these areas, in these next-generation capabilities, and you have testified before in front of this committee that we currently can match China in AI. As you depart your position, do you believe our current level of investment and level of focus on AI will be sufficient to compete with China over the next 30 years?
Congressman, 30 years is a long time. I think it is an absolute priority. And when we come out with our science and technology strategy, one of the things that it will emphasize is speed and complexity, and particularly speed to decision making, which means that algorithms and gathering vast amounts of information and understanding that information quickly will be one of the keys to success in future warfare.
So China's made a commitment of $150 billion between now and 2030, which is only 11 years away. I think the number in this year's budget was $927 million for the Department of Defense on AI. Do you feel comfortable?
I don't think any of us can feel comfortable with respect to artificial intelligence.
Thanks. Secretary Wilson, in your testimony, you stated that our potential adversaries are rapidly fielding capabilities that approach our own, and in order to prevail in conflict, we'll need systems that can penetrate contested environments or have long-range effects. What does a sixth generation fighter need to be able to do that the current fighters can't?
Congressman, I may defer to the chief here on some things, but this isn't something that that I feel really comfortable talking about in an open session. But the sixth generation is probably still pretty far off. We're focused on buying the fifth generation. But Chief?
We're not, Congressman, we're not committed to a platform per se. We're committed to some key technologies.
How soon do we need to make these commitments?
Well, we've already made, what you'll see in our budget is a commitment to next generation of air dominance. With that, speaking at the unclassified level, I will just say that there are some key technologies that we're advancing that we believe will come together and be very important going forward. One of those
How soon will we need these capabilities, General?
Well, we're going to need those certainly into the 2030s.
Into the 2030s?
Absolutely.
These are capabilities that the F-35 has or does not have?
Some that the F-35 has and some that the F-35 is going to complement, and that's about as far as I can go in this forum.
Okay. General, you've been fighting admirably for more resources for your service, and I ask you, do you agree with this statement, quote, if I had more money, I would put it into lethality, not bureaucracy?
Yes.
Okay, so that was your service secretary testifying against the creation of a Space Force. Secretary Wilson continued, quote, the Pentagon is complicated enough. We're trying to simplify. This will make it more complex, add more boxes to the organizational chart, and cost more money. So what has changed about the Pentagon in the last year and a half since that testimony to change your opinion on the bureaucracy vis-a-vis a Space Force?
I will tell you, for me, sir, what changed was the decision that both the Department, the Air Force, and the White House made to build a force inside the Department of the United States Air Force. Because for me as a warfighter, it became recognizable in the business of space warfighting and business of joint warfighting, because there really is no such thing as war in space.
So in other words, you're supportive of a Space Force created within the Air Force?
Yes, I am.
But not supportive of a Space Force created outside of it?
That's correct.
So then why do we need the bureaucracy of a Space Force? Isn't the Air Force capable of doing these things?
Air Force is fully capable.
Okay, great. Secretary Wilson, Admiral Stavridis has written, Trump is right to warn that we might be attacked from space someday and of the need to be ready for it. But we are being attacked from cyberspace right now, and that demands an immediate response. He's arguing for the need for a cyber force ahead of a Space Force. Do you agree or disagree with Admiral Stavridis?
I think Admiral Stavridis highlights an important problem that's also reflected in our budget, which is the need to make sure that we're resilient with respect to cyber capabilities and that we develop more tools for cyber.
Would you agree with his prioritization that cyber right now, because we're literally being attacked daily by Russia and China, is more important than space?
I think they're both important.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres-Small.
Thank you all for your service, and thank you specifically to Secretary Wilson. We will miss you, and I'm also hopeful that there are some things we can work on together in this last dwindling time that we have. New Mexico Air National Guard is the only Air National Guard in the country without an operational flying mission, and it's one of just 3 states without its own aircraft. Yet the Air National Guard enterprise is based on established capstone principles that set the foundational framework for mission set application throughout the 54 states and territories. Specifically, one of those capstone principles is to allocate at least one unit-equipped wing and flying squadron to each state. Secretary Wilson, are states that are currently unable to align with these core principles due to divestiture of aircraft in the past, given priority for new mission opportunities?
Congresswoman, the way we do new missions in the Air Force is to look at what are the requirements of those missions and which bases or states or localities are the best to be able to accomplish those missions. As you know, I have a big part of my heart in the New Mexico Guard, and my husband was a TACO. He was a member of the New Mexico National Guard. Their loss of their F-16 aircraft was, I know, devastating to the members of the Guard and the state of New Mexico, and I hope long-term that they're able to develop a mission. One of the things that I think is important is for those units to look at how can they partner with active duty forces and meet an operational Air Force need.
Switching now to another topic that is incredibly important for New Mexico and across the country as we see increasing impacts when it comes to PFAS. Last week, I expressed my deep concerns to Acting Secretary Shanahan on the lack of leadership by the Department of Defense to proactively address the PFAS contaminants at military establishments. Secretary Wilson, I want to convey that the Air Force has showed that same lack of urgency when it comes to PFAS contaminants, particularly in New Mexico. Secretary Wilson, please explain what efforts the Air Force has taken to work with the communities affected around Cannon Air Force Base and now Holloman Air Force Base.
When the EPA identified PFAS and PFOA as emerging contaminants, the services, all of the services, went out and surveyed our sites. We looked at, I think it was 297 different sites where we might have been using this firefighting foam. We have replaced 100% of our firefighting foam. We've surveyed the drinking water on each of our bases. We've done 110 detailed site inspections. We're providing alternative water at 21 locations. There is not currently a cleanup standard, and we have reached out to both the Department of Agriculture as well as the EPA and Health and Human Services to try to encourage them to establish a cleanup standard. There are some things we can do under existing law to be able to prevent further migration of any plume, and we're doing that where we have identified problems.
So, my real concern is a lack of ownership by the Department of Defense and the Air Force specifically about this issue. It came up at the last hearing as well. EPA standards were brought up, and also in some of our conversations with staff about a lack of authority to do certain things that were having real impacts on consumption and water in New Mexico. So I want to make sure that we're working together to address this rather than trying to pass the buck. So what is it that the Air Force needs to be able to do more, to start acting, to collect, to stop increased plume spreading?
We do have the authority to prevent any further migration of the plume and also to provide clean water both on base and off base to people who are affected. The Department of Agriculture has some other authorities with respect to agricultural products which we don't have the authority to do. I would say that one of the things that's important is that less than 4% of this chemical was sold for firefighting foam, and a very small percentage of that for the military firefighting foam. So there's 1,100 commercial airports, and this particular chemical is used in waterproofing. It's used on the coatings for fast food wrappers. It's prevalent. And so there is a national issue of which we are trying to get after the part we are responsible for. I have to say, almost no one else even wants to look. And so I think we are trying to do what we can with the authorities we have for the things we're responsible for. But 96% of the problem is not even identified.
I'd ask that you prioritize addressing the part that we know exists.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank our witnesses and make one observation, going back to Secretary Wilson's initial comments about the Air Force we need. For a number of years on this committee, there were frustration among a number of members that service chiefs and secretaries were not really giving us their best military judgment about what was needed to execute the mission that they were given. And I just want to emphasize, I think it is important for us to hear from you, the Army, you think you need to carry out the missions you've been given, the Air Force you need, and it may or may not come to pass. But under the Constitution, it's our responsibility to build and support, provide, and maintain the military forces. And we'll have to have a conversation about what is acceptable risk, what is not. But as I've been listening to all of the different items under discussion here, it just reinforced to me the need that we hear from the people in y'all's position about what you believe it takes to do what you have been asked to do. And then the process will proceed from there. I think y'all have done that today, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, and I completely agree with Ranking Member Thornberry on that. I think it is very helpful for us to hear from you on that. I think, you know, the next step is, okay, if we're not able to do what it is we're asking you to do, I always submit that there's three options, the last one of which I'll close with in a second. One is, okay, we need to buy more stuff. Two is, we need to change what the mission is. You know, it may be that we're asking you to do things that don't need to be done and stretching you too thin from other things that do need to be done. And that's the piece that I don't think this committee traditionally does as much of it should, is, you know, drilling down what's the mission? Why are we doing this? Why do we say we need that? And that's a part of it I want to examine. And the other piece is something, I really want to thank Mr. Thornberry for his work on this, and that is the issue of how we spend the money at the Pentagon. And what I've always wanted to hear more from our witnesses is not just, okay, here's where we're short, but here's where, you know, we're spending money that, frankly, we don't need to be spending. Or here's an area where, you know, we looked at the books and, oh my gosh, we spent $3 billion on this and we shouldn't have. And we want to fix that, because it'd be a lot easier for us up here to advocate for more money for you if we knew it was being well spent. And sadly, the audit is not just an esoteric thing. It's not just, oh gosh, we'd really like to sort of see it. It's not like a teacher writing on your paper, show your work. You know, it really matters, because we don't know where the money's going. We can't figure out whether we need to spend it. And without question, because of the mess where we don't adequately account for where all the money is spent in the Pentagon, a ton of money has been wasted. And a lot of the problems I submit on the F-35, on all these programs that we've had, on future combat systems, on the expeditionary fighting vehicle, all these programs that were just, you know, on the aircraft carriers, that were nightmares from the start in terms of how much they wound up costing, could have been reduced if we knew what we were spending the money on, if we had an adequate accounting system within the Pentagon. So we're going to continue to emphasize making progress on that, because it's all connected. You save money there, then you got more money to meet, you know, the demands that you have outlined to us. And I agree with the ranking member. You outlined them very well. So with that, I thank you very much for your testimony, and we are adjourned.
What was your biggest takeaway from hearing today in the second hearing today in the Secretary's remarks about the Space Force at all changed your opinion about how the Space Force is being
I think the biggest takeaway today is the effect of, especially on the Air Force, of the disaster. When Secretary Wilson starts listing, okay, we got to quit doing this, quit doing this, quit doing that, that was pretty strong. And I agree with Austin, or whoever said, most members of Congress, much less the public, do not appreciate the severity of what the damage that was done, and then what it means for the Air Force more broadly. We've obviously heard about the Marine Corps as well, and so I think we've got to do the supplemental to get those facilities repaired.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. See y'all.
Right.